Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another ESAS. And I saw that sheep. You made it this time. Welcome. I've decided not to have a specific time for these streams. They're just going to be sometime in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. So, yeah. But yeah, glad you could make it for this one. And see Vic's in there too. Hey, Vic. All right. So, we're just going to get into it. One thing that I noticed before one thing I noticed before starting the stream was I noticed this next section we're about to get into is the sort of opening bit of the DLC, and this is I think this is the longest section of the video. You know, it's running right around 40 minutes, so I have. I feel like he's going to talk about a lot of stuff in the Yarnum Nightmare, or at the very least, he's going to be talking about something for a very long time. But we'll see what we can do. I completely missed the ROM one, but I did check out what the consensus was on ROM, and it didn't look like he said much about it. He did not. He did not say. I mean, he really hardly said shit about ROM, like as an actual fight. Like he vaguely talked about the lore for I think 3 minutes, and then he talked about the fight for about 30 seconds, and it was really. We got blue balled. We got blue balled hard, sheep. We got blue balled real hard. Yeah. I love the DLC, not the research hall, though, Lawrence. Yeah. Yeah, well, we're about to get into it. And this is one thing. I've only played through the DLC once, so I'm not really super versed in it. The ideas in it, I think, are neat, but I'd have to play it more to have a more fine-tuned opinion on some of the DLC stuff, particularly the bosses. But without further ado, let's oh, we can get into it in a second. I was so disappointed, man. I damn near wept as I realized it wasn't going to crap on ROM or provide a wild defense for the boss fight. I know, right? Like, you take one of the most controversial, well, probably the most controversial boss in the game, or at least the most like discussed one in terms of like hating it or loving it, and he just breezes over it, and it's like, come on, like you had an opportunity to either address the criticism and like talk about the criticisms of it, or you could have, come up with a defense of some sort if you think it's good. And I mean, to me, I've got two theories about why he sort of skirted over it. One is sort of trying to be like neutral to him, like not be like pro Acer or anti Acer, and the other is a bit more cynical. My first idea is that he skirted over it because he either doesn't have a strong opinion about it, and so maybe that's why he didn't talk about it that much. Um, because this is one thing that I think that this like this video is fundamentally different from the way I make my sort of commentaries. Like my commentaries are very mechanically based, right? And that's something that I think makes my content very useful to players as it is, because once you get over the lore and the aesthetic of the games, you're left with nothing but mechanics, right? And that's something that I think I uh, try to delve into a little bit more than, let's say, lore and stuff like that, because we play games to play games, right? And this is one thing that I need to work on with my remembering series, where I go over like TV shows and movies. Is I think you should focus on the main appeal of the medium when you're talking about the medium in this sort of like analysis driven sort of light. And when it comes to like traditional sort of media, it's mostly about storytelling, right? Like it's mostly about storytelling, like television, movies, books, comics, what have you. It's mostly about storytelling, and that's one thing that I think makes those mediums particularly interesting, is that if you don't have a good story, there are some things that can alleviate it, but storytelling is the main thing. With video games, it's very different because it's the most active sort of medium you can enjoy. You know, it's like it's it's one of those things like games are very mechanically focused, and that's one reason I talk about them a lot. But it seems like Acer is a lot more about the conceptual aspects of gaming, which there is value in discussing that. I just find it weird how you're talking about a Souls game, which is very mechanically interesting, and he doesn't bring them up that often, unless, like you said, Sheep is, like he brings them up at the expense of Dark Souls, and he breezes past a lot of the boss mechanics, you know. Now, some bosses you're just going to breeze past anyway, just because they're relatively simple, or you can get your points out in like a minute, right? But it is a weird thing that he kind of skirts over a lot of things and seems to. It seems like this video sort of indulges in his own perspective and opinions on this thing, instead of trying to keep things kind of even. Like a lot of the references to like the Lovecraftian aspects of the game, while valuable, I think that it's one of those things where actually, let me restart that. I think Acer would be one of those channels that would theorize a lot of things about the Souls series, right? And about all the games that are sort of in this genre, right? Like I feel like he's very much in line with um sort of theorizing about where things could have gone, where things should have gone. And that's one thing that I think he and I would fundamentally disagree on is I like to talk about what we have and what it led to or where it came from, as opposed to what it could have been, what it should have been, yada yada yada. I like talking about what we actually have because that's where, you know, it doesn't matter if you have conceptually the greatest movie ever made. If you make it and it turns out like shit, you made a shit movie. Right? All the ideas can be interesting to talk about, but you need to be able to, you know, you need to be able to execute your ideas. Otherwise, your ideas aren't going to work, right? It's like trying to make the best burger in the world, but instead of making the right burger, you make an overcooked, charred ball of meat, with like rotten cheese on it. Like, you need to do it right. Yeah, and like you're saying, Sheep, like it is important to cover both in the concept of like doing this kind of thing for a game. I think it is one thing where and I think it is a thing where lore and gameplay, particularly for these types of games, are important as they sort of uh, meld into each other in terms of how one affects the other. But I do find it kind of weird how mechanically interesting points are kind of skirted over in face of talking about lore, or speculation on like design, right? Because like one thing that I've learned while doing more and more commentaries is I really want to get into the mechanics and the nitty gritty of how things work and how players can enjoy it, right? And I think that is also a difference in kind of where we're coming from between Acer and I's. He mentioned in one of the earlier streams that he is making his own game, right? So he's coming at it from a developer standpoint as well as a player standpoint, as well as a Lovecraftian fan sort of standpoint, right? So he's kind of in the know and kind of in the circles of a lot of things, whereas I am just a player. I am just a player talking from a player's perspective of the thing, right? It's one of those things where when you have a game that's story heavy, like talking about lore and story more than mechanics makes a lot of sense. But these are a series where I mean, you can actually call these series sort of mechanic heavy and story light because a lot of it's not like you don't even have a direct story most of the time. It's a very basic idea of what's going on, and then the real lore is in like the little item descriptions and notes and things. Like these from software creations are very much they're not light on story, but they're very indirect about storytelling. And so it's one of those things where I think story can reasonably be put to the wayside by the player base in favor of just talking about the mechanics and the bosses and the builds and stuff like that. You know, but I do think it is a thing where I do think it is a thing where he definitely is coming from sort of one perspective on the game, whereas I come from a different perspective, and I think that's part of the reason why I've kind of talked about this video a lot. And it is a thing where I do think that there is value to sort of both of our perspectives. It's just a matter of how you implement those things, and how you talk about them too. Like skirting over ROM was like a huge wasted opportunity, and it feels like a cope almost, right? Because like ROM is notoriously picked on by the community that likes Bloodborne or doesn't like Bloodborne as a particularly bad boss, and him just skirting over it, barely acknowledging some of the problems in the fight, makes it seem like he just doesn't want to talk about something that really makes his beloved game look bad. Like his bias for the game has shown up several times in the video, and that's something that kind of it's one of those things where if he cut out anything that showed a bias in the game, him skirting over ROM would look one way, or maybe he just doesn't want to talk about it. But because of his bias towards the game, it makes me assume things that may or may not be true. But I'm assuming them because of the way he brings up other points about the game, especially when he's wrong about things and when he's fundamentally wrong about things that, as a Souls player, you should know. Yeah, and like you said, Sheep, it's like the story's not completely in your face. They give you the plot, and then you work out the lore through descriptions, and that's sort of a pro and a con with these games. Is they're story heavy, but you have to dig for them. you know, like there are interesting stories and concepts here. It's just they don't give it directly to you, like you said. And that's part of the fun, but also somewhat of a drawback too. It's kind of a double edged sword in that regard. Anyway, let's get into this video. I've talked for I don't even know how long, so let's see where we're going.
When From Software gets to making DLCs, it seems like they hone in on what the base game did best and double down on that, to the omission of seemingly everything else. What made Dark Souls 1's Ulasil expansion interesting progression wise is that it was locked behind that game's Lord Vessel. You need a dependent from the Crystal Golem in the Duke's archive to get to it, and the reason for that was that it was incorporating elements from the base game which players needed to have a grip on, like the darkness from the Tomb of the Giants, but also because the player needed to be able to warp in and out of it.
All right, I apologize if you hear me eating here and there. I haven't eaten today. This is going to be a 10 out of 10 pro stream. But I do want to go back to some of the stuff he's saying about the DLC in previous games.
From Software gets to making DLCs, it seems like they hone in on what the base game did best and double down on that, to the omission of seemingly everything else. What made Dark Souls 1's Ulasil expansion interesting progression wise is that it was locked behind that game's Lord Vessel. You need a dependent from the Crystal Golem in the Duke's archive to.
That's one thing I do agree, Sheep. I do think that Dark Souls 1 DLC is fantastic, but it's really convoluted how you get it, right? And that's annoying. And this is one thing where I think the way you interact with DLC, I think, is something that really just depends on the game and sort of how it works. Like as a whole, in terms of when you can access it, when the end game is, and when the DLC is supposed to be tackled in terms of like level or progression, like wise. Like the Souls games have always been weird about that sort of progression thing. Like, and this is one thing I brought up in my Dark Souls 3 commentary is, Dark Souls 3's DLCs, are very weird. And it's a thing where like Dark Souls 3 DLCs, like the Ring City is placed in a place where it makes sense for you to go to it next. Like you get a bonfire right next to the final boss of the base game, or you get it after completing the Ashes of Ariendel DLC, right? Which both of those require a good, like you have to be good at the game to get to that point, right? And then the Ring City is just throwing everything at the wall. But you can access the Ring City at the appropriate point, near the end of the base game, right before the Soul of Cinder fight, or you can access it after you get to an area that you could get to way too early. Like going to the Ashes of Ariendel DLC, you talk to Gale before you even fight a Lord of Cinder, potentially. Right? And that's like a really bad way to tackle the DLC placement. You know, personally, I would have had Gale like doing his little chant thing somewhere later on in the game. Perhaps perhaps in the Grand Archive somewhere. Like maybe he's up in like a little tower on the very tippy top, and he does something there. Or maybe he's praying. Maybe he appears after you beat the Twin Princes if you reload the area, and he's praying where they used to be, or something like that. There could be something, there to better balance it because I say that Frida is the hardest fight in Dark Souls 3, and she's placed before you can interact with her before a Lord of Cinder, and that's a very bad balancing problem and a very bad progression problem. Yeah, well, done the Ulasil DLC once before because of that. It was extremely boring to get to once more. Yeah, just the requirements for the DLC are really annoying. Now, granted, I don't think it should be. I don't think it should be as simple as just warp to it and then you're there. But that might be the best thing to do since they are technically placed really awkwardly. Like Dark Souls 2 DLCs in the base game are placed really awkwardly, right? Like you get 3 DLC areas before you even hit Daedric. What the fuck? Daedric, not Daedric. Drang Lake. I'm so fucking confused right now. I'm sorry. But like you can get to the 3 DLCs of Dark Souls 2 before you even get to Drang Lake Castle, right? That's an incredible balance problem. Now the Scholar did fix that, and Scholar did fix that in the placement of the keys being in specific places that you need to like do a lot of shit to unlock. But it's still a thing where progression wise, they still are placed way earlier than they need to be. I think DLCs for these games should be placed in later game areas, or should be something that you can warp to. Like I don't think it should. If you have to cop out and make it easy, just make it a simple warping, right? But place it at an appropriate point, right? Don't just throw it in at the beginning of the game. Be like, hey, here's an area, go here, and the enemies are like 100 levels above you. It's just a really their way of balancing when DLCs pop up is really odd. Yeah, yeah, and that is one thing that's weird about the Ashes of Ariandel area too. Is like you can pop in, get a bunch of large Titanite shards, and then you can get a slab. It's like you don't get the lower base, you don't get the regular shards or the chunks. You get like the second tier and the end tier. It's just really weird. They definitely should be placed in later areas. Imagine if your first Souls game and you think it's just meant to be that hard. Yeah, and this is, one of the oldest criticisms of Dark Souls 1 is that, when you drop into Firelink Shrine, you're not really sure where to go. The game does subtly point you towards Undead Burg, but you could go down to the Valley of Drakes if you have the key, or go to the skeletons and get your ass beat, right? And I think that turned a lot of players off to the game is when, the game feels harder than it needs to be. You know, this is one criticism I have of Elden Ring actually, where you load into the game, you get through the tutorial area, maybe you kill the soldier of Godric, and then when you first get out into the world, you fight the tree sentinel and he almost one-shots you every single time, right? It makes the game feel ridiculously harder than it really should be at that point in the game. Now some people can say it's a message to, I think some people can interpret that as a message to, get your health up, but I think there's a better way to do that than to have an enemy that insta kills you. I think it's very heavy-handed in Elden Ring. I think everyone has gone to those skeletons and gotten their asses handed to them. Yeah, especially just because there's a couple of weapons back there that are useful. But anyway, let's get back to his point about DLCs.
Get to it. And the reason for that was that it was incorporating elements from the base game which players needed to have a grip on, like the darkness from the Tomb of the Giants, but also because the player needed to be able to warp in and out of it.
Now, this is the thing he brought up just now about the Tomb of the Giants and the warping aspect is the first part's not really right. The second part is like you need to be able to warp to get in or out of the DLC, or not to get in, but to get out. I swear, I swear to Christ, if he just talks about Orphan of Kos's lore and not his gameplay, I will screech. I would too. It'd be like, we play games, talk about how we play them. Yeah, but what he's saying there about the DLC is, it's like you need to be able to warp out of the DLC to do shit out of the DLC, you know. But talking about the Tomb of the Giants, you don't need to know anything about Tomb of the Giants to go through the DLC. Yeah, the area with Manus is dark, but it's not nearly as dark as Tomb of the Giants. Like Tomb of the Dark. Wow, Tomb of the Giants is actually restrictive because of its darkness. Like you actually need a light source to functionally complete combat in Tomb of the Giants. You don't need that in the Abyss where Manus is. You don't need that. Or the Ulasil Dungeon, I guess is what it would technically be called. But either way.
That was the DLC's biggest issue, and it's something which Bloodborne doesn't do.
Wait a minute. Okay, let me go back. Let me go back to get the full point here.
Dependent from the crystal golem in the Duke's archive to get to it, and the reason for that was that it was incorporating elements from the base game which players needed to have a grip on, like the darkness from the Tomb of the Giants, but also because the player needed to be able to warp in and out of it. That was the DLC's biggest issue, and it's something which Bloodborne doesn't do.
Okay, so again, he's doing that. Again, he's doing a false comparison with Dark Souls 1, which really annoys the fuck out of me. Right? DLCs in these games are usually something you have to warp to anyway. So it's not necessarily something that Bloodborne fixed. So that point seems very moot by comparison, if you're comparing how to enter the DLCs by each game. Now, granted, Bloodborne's way, I think, is a much more efficient way of doing it. Just because you pick up an item in the hub and then you go to the amygdala and get grabbed, right? It's very simple. You don't have to go through a whole bunch of extra shit to get there. But on the other side, the Tomb of the Giants comparison is an utter bullshit point because, again, like I said, you don't need an actual light source to get through the abyss. So he's just making a false comparison again with Dark Souls 1 to make Bloodborne look better. It's like, yeah, Bloodborne did do the DLC, like, getting to it a lot easier, right? But there's none of this, like, the Dark Souls point about Tomb of the Giants is so just useless in this conversation. I really don't know why he brought it up, other than to complain about it in some way, right? Just, it feels weird. Yeah, I never felt like I needed a light source down in the abyss, but Tomb was so fucking dark. I know, like, I actually tested it once, just turned my brightness all the way up, even like on my monitor, turned it up, and it was still dark as fuck, right? And From's never made an area as dark as that since, right? I mean, I think some of the areas in Elden Ring could be kind of dark, but they've never made anything darker than Tomb of the Giants, which I'm kind of glad, because I think darkness as a challenge is a bit of an annoying gimmick. Although they did use things in this game and other games to kind of alleviate that were less restrictive than having to get rid of a weapon slot, but it is something weird. This issue could easily be solved by incorporating a buyable torch, but your 3 light sources are locked behind obscure stuff. Yeah, I mean, like, again, like, I think darkness as an enemy or as a challenge to sort of take into account when doing stuff, I think could be an interesting dynamic in these games they could expand upon, right? I don't think they should just straight up not do it. But there are things that they have done that I think does help with dealing with it. Like in Bloodborne and in Elden Ring, you can have an item that you basically equip and it glows on you, right? It's a little lantern that just, sticks on your side, right? Like that's a very useful item for going around dark areas while still letting you use both of your weapons in each hand. So they've found a way to work around it. And that's one thing I will give to Bloodborne is that when the area is dark, it is nice that you can have like a little light source on you that helps. That is nice. That is an improvement from Bloodborne, right? Which is something he could talk about, but again, I just don't think he's going to talk about it.
Once the player has the eye of a Bloodborne hunter, they can get to Erden's Chapel and go into the DLC. When it comes to considering the changes to the game's mechanics, I'm not really a purist in any way. I recognize that some mechanics do some things better in some situations. I've said my piece on how warping fractured the experience somewhat, but this is a case of it opening the experience up. The beginning of this area very much is in keeping with what we saw in the beginning of the Ulasil experience.
Back that up, get that full point that he's making. I do like lighting areas too, like in DS2, but I don't want to have my moveset gimmicked by having one hand occupied with the torch. Exactly. Like it's a cool gimmick. They just made it very cumbersome to actually deal with. That's what I actually am not against the ideas that Dark Souls 2 introduced of having a torch that you use to light stuff. That's not a bad idea. The way they implement it is kind of clunky, but I do think it's a decent idea, like in principle. Just again, a lot of ideas in DS2 aren't bad. It's just the mesh of all of them together radically imbalances the game. But there are some good ideas in there if they just took a little time to refine them. But I want to go back to this point Acer just made about warping.
Is that some mechanics do some things better in some situations. I've said my piece on how warping fractured the experience somewhat, but this is a case of it opening the experience up.
See, like there, what he just said about warping opening things up is that's the thing about DLCs in these games. They're usually not finished by the time the game is done and released. So you need to be able to get players to the DLC without having them have to do anything crazy to get there, so they're not put off by it. Like, unless you're going to make like a physical part of the world that is DLC specific, and you need to buy something to open like a door, let's say, that's one thing. But being able to warp to it is way easier, especially in the concept of Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne. All these areas, are reached through a lantern or some teleportation device, and it takes you to a different sort of universe, let's say, whether it's a different time frame or it's a nightmare or it's a different section of the world altogether that is not physically connected to the world you're in. It's like there are ways to do it, to make it where, warping is useful, but just him, talking about the warping here is like, now it opens it up. It's like kind of a, yeah, this is where warping helps.
The beginning of this area very much is in keeping with what we saw in the beginning of the Ulasil expansion. An area from the base game has been remodeled to be in keeping with an older version of itself and serves as the entrance into the experience. Ulasil actually had a boss prior to that section in the Sanctuary Guardian, but details. What Artorias did better from the get-go was the placement of Elizabeth. She was a mushroom NPC placed early into the DLC, and she filled the player in on the details and gave players their heading. We will get such a character in Simon, and boy does he elevate the entire Bloodborne experience, but it's not right away like it could have been, so we're going to be a bit aimless until we open up the shortcut from the little bridge area back to the lantern. Artorias also had new enemies which built on the pre-existing lore to fill out the map with, some even being the ancestors of the ones in the base game, and that approach returns here. We have the Beast Patience from Old Yarnum, which immediately tells players that the Healing Church is up to no good, but we also have the Old Hunters. Way back when, I talked about how, because Bloodborne does not force the player to ever upgrade a single stat, it's in the spirit of things that the difficulty threshold of the late game be balanced to allow unleveled characters to win.
Okay, we're gonna go back through that because that was a weird point that he just made.
Back when I talked
Fuck the patience, man. Oh my god, that one room filled with like 20 of them. Yeah, just there's a lot of things that these DLCs like will throw at you, and sometimes they always produce one area that's just a pure fuck you moment. Like from a player standpoint of the developer, it's like every game has an area, usually at least one in the DLC, where you just want to slap the developer and be like, "Why the fuck did you do that?" That's so annoying. Dark Souls 3 is a really good example with the giant fucking dudes, that summon unkillable archers and like wizards and like tank crushers. You know, it's just like you're making this fight way more tedious than it could have been. But anyway, let's go back to this one point because he makes a really weird point here.
About how because Bloodborne does not force the player to ever upgrade a single stat, it's in the spirit of things that the difficulty threshold of the late game be balanced to allow unleveled characters to win.
That's a really odd point. Because Bloodborne doesn't make you level up a stat, it means the end game has to be beatable. It's like all of these games are beatable with a soul level 1 with unupgraded gear. You can beat the game with your fucking fists. Okay? Like, this is one thing that makes these games interesting is that you don't have to be a particular level to win, right? Like, you can actually beat the game if you're good enough at level 1 without damage even, right? Like, it is possible, and that's interesting. But this Bloodborne thing of saying you don't have to level up stats is very much a misrepresentation of the other games. Is like, if you want to use like basic weaponry in Bloodborne, you can. You don't have to upgrade it. And most starting classes will be able to wield some of the weapons you spawn with, right? So it's not like it's not like you're going to be out of luck in terms of weapons, right? And this is the thing, all the games do this. All the games have weapons that most base classes can pick up and use. This isn't a thing that makes Bloodborne special. If anything, Bloodborne just doesn't have as many reasons to level up stats, besides health and stamina, unless you just really want to use a particular weapon. I tried Blood level 4 made to the DLC, and you cannot tell me they made this with level 4 and 9. Yeah. Games are usually so balanced that you could do those challenges, yeah. Most of the time. Dark Souls 2, I say, is an exception because it fucks with the dodge mechanics, and that really screws up soul level 1 runs. It's just a weird point. They don't make the game with level 1 in mind. It's just that the game is fair, so you can impose that challenge. Yeah. And that's, basically what I'm saying. It's just, you can do it, but that doesn't mean it's like ideal or that it's built to work with that. It's just the mechanics allow you to do that. A opposite example of this would be something like World of Warcraft, where hard levels are needed to complete challenges, right? Like a level 1 is not going to be able to kill a level 50, right? Because that's how the mechanics work. There's no dodge function, that allows you to avoid all damage consistently if you have the right timing. It's like, after a certain point, low levels are going to be squashed by high levels. Most leveling games have that in mind. Dark Souls or this whole Souls series is interesting because, you're able to do that once you get good enough. It is possible to get through these games without making a mistake and without leveling up at the same time, right? And that's a fun thing in the game, is to see how people manage to overcome challenges at such a low level with so little resources and without, dying. Like, it's impressive and also a little sad that people get that good at the game. Like, I'm good enough to where I think I can get through the games with maybe a handful of deaths by the end, but I don't ever want to be that good, right? That sinks way too much time into it if it's gonna, I don't want to. This is one thing. I'd rather play other games than play these games to the point where I get so damn good that I don't take damage at all during a playthrough. But that's just me. Yeah, Dark Souls 2 is an exception. No ADP is absolute torture. You don't know pain till Vendrick pancakes the air and you die instantly. Oh man, that's one thing that I think would have been interesting. Is I would be interested to see some people play Dark Souls 2 without the knowledge of the ADP stat affecting dodging, or better yet, just tell people that there's no dodge, right? And just see how it works. Like, see how they try to complete the game without the dodge, right? There's so much that's just going to be a problem. And also, these games are, over the years, these games have become have held more of a crutch, because of the dodging thing. It used to be a cool thing, but now it's like all the builds are, like all the builds are, very, very, wow, I just lost my train of thought. Fuck. Damn, I completely forgot the point I was going to make. I'm getting old. I could do level 1, but Deathless? Nope. I did like 3 level 1s in DS3, tried Deathless and died in the High Wall of Lothric. Yeah. I mean, it's that thing too. It's like, because of the dodge mechanic, all of these games are beatable at level 1, but it's very dependent on that dodge mechanic. If that dodge mechanic does not work appropriately, Dark Souls 2, you can't do it. Oh, but yeah, this is one thing that I mentioned about the dodging. I got my point back. I found it. But yeah. So my point with the dodging mechanic kind of becoming a crutch is that a lot of the builds are getting streamlined, where you basically the best way to deal with damage is to simply dodge it. Because I'm currently working on an Elden Ring video, kind of going over the top 5 best things and the top 5 worst things about the game. And I'm going to play the crap out of the game for that video so I get the most context possible. And I'm going to do basically all the basic builds that you can do in the game. And one thing that I've noticed throughout that run is that, tank builds have been hindered as these series go on. Now, some games don't have tank builds. Like Bloodborne doesn't have a tank build that you can do reasonably, and as far as I know, Sekiro doesn't have any sort of tank build. Because there's no real way to tank, I think, in that game. But in the Souls games and in Elden Ring and and in Demon Souls, if you look at the trajectory of how certain builds work, they usually fall back on dodging as the best way to deal with it. Because why take half your stamina bar to block a huge attack when you can simply roll through it and use like a quarter of the stamina? It's just the system is built to dodge and make that more effective than blocking, right? And that's I think you can say is a trade-off with the way the risk reward. Dodge blocking is the least amount of risk. For the least amount of reward. It's a thing where like the builds are getting compromised because the dodge mechanic is relied on so heavily. That's kind of a thing that when you give players the optimal way to negate damage, and it's the same thing over and over and over, but the attacks and the combos get longer and more damaging and more stamina consuming, people are going to start dropping builds that use shields and just focus on dodging because it's cheaper, it's faster, and it's better in some situations. Like playing Elden Ring as like an early game tank build is tough without twinking out. Like it makes the combat so much slower. It feels like you don't get anywhere either when you block an attack and half your stamina is gone, and that's the first attack in a 3-swipe combo. So by the time the third swipe hits you, you're out of stamina, you're stunned, and you get pancaked. It's just annoying as fuck. Top 5 worst, I got you. Endgame scaling, duos, animation reading, mountaintops, Millennia. Some of those are going to be in my top 5. I'm not talking as much about specifics in terms of the top 5 and in each category. It's more of sort of conceptually, right? Like for an example, one of my top 5 best things about the game is the world. The level design, the way they interconnects, how much content is in them. So it's not really super specific things in the video. Obviously, I won't give too much away because that defeats the purpose of making the video and having you watch it. But all those things you mentioned, Sheep, are definitely problems that I will bring up. Yeah, and like you said, like tank builds have just gotten a shorter and shorter stick in these games. I'd say after Dark Souls 1. Like Dark Souls 1 has it where you can legitimately no dodge your way through the entire game. You can just shield it. Dark Souls 2 started to kind of push it to its limits. Dark Souls 3 made it where certain things you're just not going to be able to block. Like it will just drain all of your stamina. And then you've got Elden Ring, which makes it ridiculous. Yeah, and that's one thing I will talk about too is in the video is the difficulty of Elden Ring and how that adversely affects the game, where I think it helps with some of the other games. But anyway, back to this video.
Challenge is core to these games, so they play better when the player can take that challenge to its extreme. But
I don't know. Taking the challenge to the extreme, I don't think is the best way to tackle these games. But I think that's more of an interpretatable thing. You're blue balling us until that video comes out. Well, let's say this video is going to take a while to come out because, just for context, I'm going to do 10 runs of Elden Ring where I beat every single boss. 5 of them, and they're going to be broken up into 5 different builds. It's going to be a tank build, a glass cannon build, a sorcery build, an incantation build, and an arcane build. So 5 basic builds that most other builds kind of like originate from. And yeah, 10 runs. Yeah. And this is the ultimate like thing of me saying, I have gotten good. Now here are my problems. Because one thing I hate is when people make fun of a game when they're not good, or they say your argument's invalid because you've not gotten good. It's like, bitch, I'm gonna beat the game 10 times over with 5 different builds. You can fuck off with that criticism. Okay. I have gotten good. But also it's just for context in case I'm missing something. But so basically gist of the video is I'm gonna do 10 runs. 5 of them are they're gonna be broken up into pairs. So there's gonna be a basic run and then an informed run. The basic run will be me exploring sort of naturally with the given build, and the sort of experienced run will be me looking and basically making a twink version of that build, or a optimized version of that build. And I'm going to be doing tank, glass cannon, sorcery, incantation, and arcane. Right. So 10 runs total. One that's meant to be sort of an early player, and the other one's supposed to be like a I know where shit is, I know how to deal with shit sort of version of those builds. You know, I hate that you got to do extreme challenges to criticize a Souls game these days. I mean, I don't technically have to do this. I'm doing this partly because I want to see if I'm wrong, like see if there are a lot of things in the game that are easily dealt with if you know like a simple thing, because I want to be as fair to Elden Ring as possible. So I want to play the crap out of it with all of the options available to make sure I'm not missing something. So it's more for me making the video than it is for the actual video's points, so to say. But I have a feeling that a lot of my criticisms of the game will remain the same, but some of them will be alleviated slightly. But I'll deal with that when it comes to that video. I have no idea when that video is gonna come out. It's gonna take me probably a while. Like a while. I do a little bit of maging, so make sure you grab Night Comet. It's invaluable in that most enemies will just dodge all your other spells. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna bring up the enemy AI ability to read your attacks and actions, because that shit gets old, man. Like playing as a sorcery build in every game before Elden Ring was fun. After Elden Ring, I just kind of want sorcery to get like taken out of the game because of how fucking useless it becomes later on in the game. It is just so damn annoying when they dodge your shit the whole time. Now, if you spam an attack, I think it's fair for them to dodge every other thing, maybe. To, tell players don't spam it. But at the same time, there are so many just input reading bullshit moments of them just taking your spell and just negating all the FP that you dumped, into that spell. It's just annoying as hell. Now, there are some spells that work around that, but that's mainly because of the wind up. But anyway, I will talk about Elden Ring in the Elden Ring video. I need to get back to Bloodborne. I want to finish this fucking video.
But what that means is that the difficulty scaling cannot break the fundamentals which unleveled characters have going for themselves. The Old Hunters DLC has the strongest enemies in the game, bar some chalice dungeons, but every enemy here must be clearable by the weakest version of the player for the game's sense of fairness to be maintained.
Now, what he just said there. Let me go back, get the full quote.
Dungeons, but every enemy here must be clearable by the weakest version of the player for the game's sense of fairness to be maintained.
Now, this is one thing. The way he's explaining it is really clunky and bad, but his overall point is sound in that the mechanics basically work consistently that allow the player to survive these encounters. And that largely depends on accurate hitboxes and consistent dodge mechanics working appropriately. If those two things fuck up, Dark Souls 2, you're going to have a hard time doing the low level runs. Because at that point, it's not the game's fault. At that point, it's not your fault for being bad. It's the game's fault for making the encounter dishonest, basically. I get them dodging the spell substitute first to encourage you actually looking for openings, but frame 1, come on, bro, I have limited FP. Yeah, it basically just negates all spellcaster builds unless the target is giant, like the fire giant or the dragons or whatever. It's just really fucking annoying, especially when it's like the hardest boss ever in Melania, right? It's just annoying when you're a mage build and you're like, well, I guess I have to use all the spells I'm not geared to use because your twitchy ass can dodge everything. But anyway.
The entire combat system is predicated on the stamina bar, so to balance out this area, FromSoft would have needed to prove it is beatable by a character with the base stamina regeneration speed and stamina size.
Dude, I'm so sick of him picking just one random specific thing and making his entire argument around that one thing when it talks about multiple different things. I was thinking he was talking about level 1 players, but I guess he means that the DLC is to be balanced around the very base mechanics. I mean, this is one thing, right? Is these games are predicated on the combat system being the way it is, right? Where you have dedicated animations to attacking, healing, dodging, all this other stuff. And you need those mechanics to work accordingly. You need your heal to go through appropriately when the animation lines up, damage go through when the animation lines up, dodging go through the way it should, given the way it works in that particular game. Right? I thought he was talking about low levels too, but like he's using different language to describe the same thing when that different language means different things. And it's like I don't get this. I'm gonna go back though because I want to talk about what he just said about the stamina meter.
The entire combat system is predicated on the stamina bar, so to balance out this area, FromSoft would have needed to prove it is beatable by a character with the base stamina regeneration speed and stamina size.
All right. All right. So this one particular point about the stamina meter is he's taking one aspect of the core combat and making it the focal point when that's not the focal point. There is no focal point in the combat system. The combat system is a mixture of stamina management and dodging management, especially in Bloodborne, given that shields are next to useless in this game, right? You have to be able to dodge appropriately and attack appropriately and manage your stamina bar appropriately. Those three things are what makes the combat a flowing system. It's not just the stamina management, right? It's what you do with that stamina that matters, right? If all you do is dodge, you're never going to kill the boss. If all you do is smack the boss, you're going to take a fuck ton of damage and probably die because you're not going to have enough stamina to dodge. It's like these things work in tandem. The stamina bar is not the end all be all of your existence. It's a part of the system that makes the combat flow. It's like it's like, why are you focusing so hard on this one little stamina point? It's like I've noticed I went and rewatched all my previous streams because I'm a fucking narcissist. Um but he makes a lot of points about strange specific mechanical things that are a part of a larger system that he either doesn't talk about or doesn't seem to realize that he needs to incorporate those things into this discussion. It's a really weird aspect of this video that is purported throughout the entire thing. And it's really annoying because it's like talking about this game's combat and saying that dodging is really important and then not mentioning stamina management or attack management, right? It's like you need to mention those things because they all play a part in how you beat the game. It's like he's like bringing up 1/3 of the total package and then moving on without talking about the other parts of it that are important, that are either equally as important or more important. Anyway, Lauren's proceeding to one-shot your character model that's 2 bodies away from his arm. Yeah, the bigger the bosses are and the more weirdly shaped they are, the more they tend to get worse. That's just because most hitboxes are designed for people, so it's kind of a thing where you have to like hope that they do a good job with. I would assume that players would go through this with base stamina regen because only one rune boosts it, right? Yeah, I think only one rune does boost stamina regen. I know there are runes that increase your overall stamina, but I don't think it's a lot. I think it's like 10%. I think he mentioned it in one thing, but yeah, it's definitely a thing where like there are some I think there is one stamina regeneration rune, but in any case, like it's not really about your regeneration rate, it's how you use your stamina. That's the main point. And he's talking about it in such a weird way.
That means there is probably some universal minimum safe frames coded into every enemy for the player to be able to deal damage without getting hit themselves.
Yeah, and it's like that's like if these combat systems did not have like breathing time in between attacks, then this combat system would be an utter mess. You know, it's like like these combat systems would not work if there was no break and stunning was still a thing. Now, if you did not get stunned, that's one thing, right? But that would radically change the whole concept of this combat system if getting stunned was not a thing. But anyway.
If that's so, then the universal minimum save frames for enemies can never be shortened. Every enemy here must have them. But in absolute terms, this is also the only component of the enemies which cannot be tuned around. Their damage values can go up, their defenses and health pool the same. And actually, when I say the minimum save frames can't be dialed with, I mean dialed down. It is totally acceptable to use the anticipation period of an enemy's attack wind-up animation to bait the player into dodging or trying to get a parry in early. And we can see that approach used a lot in the old hunters we meet.
This is one thing that annoys me about this game is he is wasting so many fucking bullets on these enemies. It's like their dodging thing is over. It's like their dodging thing is over, and then he shoots them, or their attack animation is over, and then he shoots them. It's like that either shows the keylogging issue, or it shows like, or it shows him just wasting fucking bullets. That is just so annoying. Yeah, and weapon at risk. It's like he must have been running this area a lot for his weapon to be at risk, and he's got like 35,000 like blood echoes, so he's not like he must have he must be just running around here in one go to try to make everything work because he's out of bullets. Anyway. Oh. Oh boy, let's get back to. He's literally out of bullets as well. He's using blood bullets now. Yeah, it's like he's really stretching, like going through this area in one go, which I understand. I'm kind of like that too. Like I want to get through the area at once so I don't have to re-clear it. But still, it's like, holy shit.
Wind-up enemy.
Whoa, shit. Use your bullets better is the advice I would give.
To bait the player into dodging or trying to get a parry in early. And we can see that approach used a lot in the old hunters we meet. Their attacks seem to be a bit delayed from their wind-ups, and they also have bigger health bars, tighter defenses, and they just hit harder. I've never come into the DLC without these guys providing a good challenge at the minimum, so I think it's safe to say that this area was designed to be the last one the player went through before closing out the game in the hunter's dream.
This is one thing that I have a problem with when it comes to most of these games is, a lot of the DLCs are built to be taken after you complete the game, right? Like the enemies are supposed to be tougher on average, the bosses are supposed to be tougher on average than the late game content. That's usually the idea they have going into the DLCs. And and it's like there's it's like the DLCs are obviously meant to get people to come back and play the game, but they're usually built for players who have already completed the base game. So they usually go above and beyond to make it a little bit harder, right? Make it more challenging and to give more difficult encounters, right? And that's one thing that all the DLCs do. The problem is that a lot of DLCs can be reached too early, and that's the big problem. And we went over this earlier. It's like, when you have Ashes of Ariandel in basically the early game of Dark Souls 3, that radically fucks up when players should go there and when they get things. It radically fucks up the flow of like the difficulty. When you just have this random spike and then it comes back down again when you complete the DLC and you come back home. Or you go to the Ring City and go to the hardest shit in the game. It's like it's not balanced and the flow is not very good. And this is one thing that Bloodborne really should have fixed from Dark Souls 1 is having the ending take place after you beat the final boss of the base game. That's something I hate about Dark Souls 1. It's something I hate about Bloodborne as well. I'm really glad that Dark Souls 2, 3, and Elden Ring did not do that, where the game just ends and you're thrown into New Game Plus right after you defeat the last boss. I hate that mechanically, and oh shit, sorry, and that was really bad. Hope it didn't break your eardrums, but I really hope that he does not try to skirt over the fact that Bloodborne makes the same mistake that Dark Souls 1 does by forcing you into New Game Plus, because I really hate that in both Dark Souls 1 and this. So this isn't me being biased against Dark Souls 1. I hate that thing where you're forced into New Game Plus no matter what. I believe that you should be able to get to the end game, complete the game, and then be able to just roam around the world, right? I don't think you should be forced into New Game Plus. That is a stupid developer decision. Anyway, this isn't even far from the lamps as well. So how he burned through 20 plus bullets when he's fought about 4 hunters max is beyond me. Well, I think we know. I think he just wastes bullets. I think he's just bad with the gun at certain points in this run. Because you saw earlier, he was just spraying that dude, after his attacks went through. So either his key logging is coming up and that's being an issue, or he's just wasting bullets. They can be accessed really early. All you have to do is beat Vicar Amelia, and you're in the DLC. Yeah, it's way it's way too early. Like you get to this hard shit way too early. And it's awkward because you have to put this stuff in before the final fight. Which means that you basically either have to defeat one boss and then not talk to Gurman, defeat two bosses. Actually, no, you either have to defeat the Murgo's Wet Nurse and not talk to Gurman afterwards to avoid New Game Plus, or you have to, beat Virgo. I'm getting so confused with names today. You have to beat Murgo's Wet Nurse and then activate Gurman, but not kill him for an ending, or you have to beat both of them and then not kill the Moon Presence when it spawns. Right? Working around that is so cumbersome, especially if you don't have any Bold Hunter's marks to get out of there without losing all the blood echoes that you acquired from beating the bosses. It's really annoying. Yeah, I had to do Lawrence in New Game Plus after Orphan served me my ass because I was in post-salt mode and it forced me in New Game Plus after. Yeah. Or after Gurman, yeah. Yeah, that's one thing that's annoying about this and Dark Souls 1 is just forcing you into New Game Plus is such a stupid idea.
The Artorias DLC remixed the best of the main game's levels to provide the tightest dungeon crawling experience in that game. Seriously, the Ulasil run plays almost like a Demon Souls level. It did have...
What the hell? I gotta go back and get that. What is he talking about?
Game's levels to provide the tightest dungeon crawling experience in that game. Seriously, the Ulasil run plays almost like a Demon Souls level. It did have some optional paths here and there, usually leading to dead ends, but for the most part, Ulasil was very tightly directed.
Okay, so that's what he's talking about with the Demon Souls level? It's like, saying it's like a Demon Souls level makes me think, okay, so it was just a level? like he didn't really mean much by that. Yeah, but then he qualified it by saying, it's well directed. And that is one thing I will give. The DLC for Dark Souls 1 is pretty well directed. It's very hard to miss the pathway forward in that DLC. It's very hard to miss it. Now you can explore for a little bit, but it is very hard to miss which way you're supposed to go. But yeah. Especially Dark Souls 1, that difficulty spike is no joke. I was in full Havel getting gobsmacked by regular hollows. Yeah, well, that's the thing is to me, there are two big difficulty curves when playing a Souls game. The first is playing it the first time. The second is playing it for the first time in New Game Plus. Those, when the enemies get that huge boost to health and damage, dealt, that is where the game really ticks up and you really get to push the combat to its limits. Which is part of the fun of New Game Plus, but it's also a thing where it's I wish you didn't force me into it.
It didn't lean on complex level design as much as interesting environmental design to stand out. This is one area in which I consider Bloodborne's DLC to be a step up. Mapped out, Artorias was two somewhat open areas, the Royal Woods and the Chasm of the Abyss, connected with a mostly linear tunnel in Ulasiel Township. The Old Hunters opens on a linear level, which is arguably as complex as anything in Artorias, though, and it opens to two back-to-back interconnected areas. And there's a lot of smart applications of Miyazaki staples when it comes to contextualizing.
All right, I need to go back here. He's making a really big point about the level design. And I want to be able to get the full thing. But first, more sheep. It would have been nice if they added new armors and whatnot for New Game Plus. Dark Souls 2 kind of had the right idea, but added more tedium to it too. Yeah, and this is one thing. Dark Souls 2 New Game Plus is actually kind of interesting by comparison, right? Adding the new enemies, stuff like that. That is neat. It's kind of weird to add that in New Game Plus, but it is a neat shift from what we traditionally got. AKA even more red phantoms, not to be confused with NPC invaders. Literally just enemies painted red for more ganking potential. Yeah, it's like Dark Souls, again, Dark Souls 2, a lot of great ideas implemented really poorly. But anyway, let's get back to this main point he's making about the level design, because I'm going to have something to say about this.
Levels to provide the tightest dungeon crawling experience in that game. Seriously, the Ulasiel run plays almost like a Demon Souls level. It did have some optional paths here and there, usually leading to dead ends, but for the most part, Ulasiel was very tightly directed. It didn't lean on complex level design as much as interesting environmental design to stand out. This is one area in which I consider Bloodborne's DLC to be a step up.
Okay, he considers Bloodborne DLC to be a step up from the level design of the Artorias thing. So let's see what he says about that. What's up, Vancaris? Big fan of the channel. Thank you. I use your Dark Souls commentary videos as sleep aids. But I also have watched the commentaries in full and enjoyed them greatly from start to finish. I'm glad you enjoyed them. And that's one thing. If the worst thing I do is make good sleep aids, then hey, I'm glad you got some good sleep. Yeah, I appreciate the bedtime voice. I actually thought about making like ASMR videos of just doing something ridiculous, like reading some terrible book, but doing it in like an ASMR book voice thing. But that's such a meme project that it's probably not worth actually pursuing. Anyway, back to this level design discussion.
Mapped out, Artorias was two somewhat open areas, the Royal Woods and the Chasm of the Abyss, connected with a mostly linear tunnel in Ulasiel Township.
Okay, that's a pretty fair representation of talking about the interconnectivity of the levels, and the openness of them. Because the opening area, because you kind of have the DLC split up into different chunks. You have basically from, like the, sorry, I've got a burp coming up. It's not good. It's not good. Oh, doctor. But yeah. So like the Artorias DLC starts with like from the first boss. The name is escaping me right now. To Artorias, that whole area is pretty open, right? Like you have a path to go, but it's still pretty open to explore and get like some gear and upgrade materials and stuff like that. So that's pretty open. Then from Artorias basically down to the dungeon, it's pretty linear, but there are little offshoots for things. And then when you get to the Chasm of the Abyss, it's similar to the first area where it's kind of open. There's a vague direction to push you towards Manus at the bottom, but it is kind of it's a more open area, then a little bit more linear, then a more open area sort of a thing. So I do get where he's coming from with that. What I take issue with is what I think he's about to say.
The Old Hunters opens on a linear level, which is arguably as complex as anything in Artorias, though, and it opens to two back-to-back interconnected areas.
Now, this is the one thing that you wonderful viewers in the chat might have to help me with, because I've played through the DLC once, and I've not done it again, largely because I don't like playing on console. I'm sorry, I'm that racist against PlayStation. But just if I remember correctly, you go from here, like you fight around this sort of like area of the nightmare, and then you go and fight Ludwig, and after him you go through sort of like the like hall thing sort of area. I'm not sure what to call it. It's like a study hall sort of thing. And then I believe you fight through there and you defeat the boss with the multiple like arcane shooting dudes. I forget what they're called. And then I think after them is more sort of study area, like research area place. Then you fight Maria, and then you get the fishing hamlet, which is, from what I remember, is pretty open in terms of what you can do. Still a clear path, or still a path, but it's pretty open. It's not like a hallway. It's like a big open area, but you start from one end and have to get to the other. So what I think he's saying, I think is true, but I'm going off of memory of playing the game one time, so I'm not that versed in it. After him, you go through that little cellar area with the prison cells, then up the stairs to the shitty NPC duo, then the research hall. Yeah, I remember them. I remember the prison cells, and I do remember the dynamic duo past what's his face. After Maria, yeah, fishing hammer. Then you go through the mine shaft kind of thing. Then orphan. Okay, I basically remembered it. That's good enough. But yeah. So I mean, I kind of see where he's getting, where Bloodborne may have done more with its levels compared to Dark Souls 1, which, I mean, I'd have to play the DLC more to have a more refined opinion about it, but I guess what he's saying there is technically true in that you have more areas to go through with more dynamics, I guess. But it also might be bigger, but I'm not sure. I was streaming the duo and I got so pissed because my friends they would drop some good gear, only for me to realize 2 madmen knowledge. That's that is one fun thing, is when you take friends through something and you fuck with them. So I feel your pain, but at the same time, they got you good. Yeah, but I've been there. It's frustrating in the moment, but it's a good story for you to tell later.
And there's a lot of smart applications of Miyazaki staples when it comes to contextualizing progress. Miyazaki really likes to merge space and time into one in his games, and that's how this DLC is laid out. Every area is a bit further back in time, and the context we are provided with to make us advance is that there is something in the history which caused the curse being embodied by the tainted moon in the sky. The astral clock tower was a big focal point of the base game's level layout, so it makes sense that reaching it is the objective here.
They did. It was miserable too. They've been running down and up the stairs for like 5 minutes. Yeah. Well, that duo really is cancer to begin with. I mean, if they did it one at a time, like if one was at the bottom of the elevator and one was at the top, that would be different. But putting them together just makes it so much more grating. Oh, this is a pretty bad boss run. Got to wait for the door to open every single time. Do you? Like I didn't fight Lawrence when I went through the DLC on my run, so I'm kind of out of loop on the DLC for this game a little bit. So if you have to go through that door over and over, man, that is such a waiting on the NPC moment.
The moon is the most prominent feature of the skybox. Well, the moon and the clock tower, which shows up everywhere. And since you're aware of this game's legacy of having a thing in the sky change to trigger a change in the world, it should not be a surprise to see this moon theme reused in the DLC. The curse of the hunters originates from this nightmare and is embodied by the tainted moon. If the player manages to kill the Orphan of Kos, then the curse shall be lifted, and the hunters will all feel a weight lifted from them. I consider the contextualization of progress in this DLC to be the most interesting Miyazaki has yet thrown our way, but more than that, it's interesting specifically compared to Artorias because the happenings here are actually neat to know information.
Wait a minute. He's talking about the context of this. And it's like, it's actually need to know. It's like, what do you need to know? Like, what do you need to know from this DLC that, makes it more important to this story than the Artorias one to Dark Souls 1 story? If anything, Dark Souls 1 story just adds extra context to certain events in the main game, right? That, make certain stories that much more tragic. I mean, just look at the Sif Artorias, like, bond. That shit hits hard. Like, I still remember Vadi's Prepare to Cry video on it. It was great. Good times. Sif is such a good boy. Yep, it's basically Vicar Amelia's run, but worse, because you gotta avoid the flaming ball, then go up to wait for the door, then avoid Big Man. Take some words out of that sentence, and you've got, like, just a really funny lineup for a joke. Like, a Vicar, a flaming ball, and a Big Man walk into a bar. That guy just killed Acer? Yeah, you gotta slip past him on every attempt. Yeah. I mean, that guy's a boss in and of himself with how much health he has, how much damage he does, especially after that buff.
Feel a weight lifted from them. I consider the contextualization of progress in this DLC to be the most interesting Miyazaki has yet thrown our way, but
Here's one little point to mention. You see, back here, he
DLC to be
he hit the bullet heal, and instead of using what he described as the optimal way to gain health back by using the rally mechanic, he did it way too early to recover any of that health. I just thought I'd mention that because that's something we found incredibly hilarious in the previous streams, where he would mention something and then do something that completely counteracts what he just said. It's also just bad optimization. Like, wait until you're next to the NPC up there before you, like, do your blood bullets. It's like, damn. I mean, I thought I was thought of that joke, but now I'm going to download that and use it at some point. Feel free to. Feel free to. That'd be funny. A Vicar, a flaming ball, and a Cthulhu walk into a bar. I don't even know what the rest of that joke would be. Just have fun with it. But anyway, let's get back to this contextual shit.
The most interesting Miyazaki has yet thrown our way, but more than that, it's interesting specifically compared to Artorias because the happenings here are actually neat to know information.
Again, I'm not really sure what you need to know in the DLC for the main game that isn't just as important with the Artorias stuff and Dark Souls 1. Again, it feels like that comparison. It feels like that false comparison thing he's done a lot throughout this video, basically just saying Bloodborne better than Dark Souls 1. Tee. It's like, you got to substantiate that, dude.
I like the Artorias DLC a lot, but
I don't think you do, based on how you describe it sometimes.
Information. I like the Artorias DLC a lot, but it does not tell a story which the game falls apart not telling.
Just like this DLC. It's like these DLCs are extra context to the main game. They're not a fundamental part of the story that you need to know. Yeah, it's like, we don't need to know this. It just gives more context for some of the shit the church did, and for some of the shit regarding like the Hunter's history and how they dealt with things. It's like the DLCs just add more context. That's all they really do. There's nothing wrong with that. It's also just that false equivalency to Dark Souls just really gets on my nerves, because he keeps saying Bloodborne is better than something Dark Souls did, and then doesn't really substantiate it, or he outright misrepresents what Dark Souls did. And that got really annoying. I think it was in part like 12 or something when we went over it. It's just really annoying. But you'll already know that the church is shady as fuck, since a note in the first area kind of hints at it, as well as the burning of Old Yarnum. Yeah, it's like, this stuff just reinforces points we already saw. Now it does go into some different things and does do some different, does give some interesting context for certain things, certain events, certain characters and stuff like that. But the Artorias DLC does the same shit, right? That's how it is. And this is one thing where I think it's actually the most fair to compare this to Dark Souls 1 because these are the only games that have DLC. As far as I know, Elden Ring may be different, and I didn't play Sekiro that much. But from what I understand, these are the only games where the DLC actively takes place in the past. Like the Artorias DLC takes place in the past. This DLC takes place in the past. For Dark Souls 2, I think it's just it's in the same timeline as the main game. It's just not like before the main game. I think it's like after. And Dark Souls 3 DLC is definitely after the main game, right? And we have yet to see of Elden Ring. I'm assuming Elden Ring is afterward because I think they kind of learned after a while that making all this prequel DLC means that you're kind of limited in what you can do in terms of like progressing the story, which could lead you to do interesting shit, which hopefully the Elden Ring DLC will do. And I do plan to actually play the Elden Ring DLC, and I thought about streaming some of it, but I feel like streaming for like 3 hours every day, or not every day. Every day would be nice. Streaming for 3 hours every Saturday of a game that's going to be out for a while is just not a good way to do it. So I might throw that up on the gaming channel. So check that out whenever. Mesmer is going to have the most delayed attacks of all time. Oh yeah, he's gonna take 3 hours to hit you, and when he does, it'll have ultra tracking, input reading, and animation canceling. This is one thing. Like, I hesitated to buy this DLC, and this is the first time that I've hesitated to buy. This is the first time I've hesitated to buy DLC for a From Software game because of Elden Ring's kind of late game difficulty spikes and how kind of atrociously like repetitive it is in terms of just spamming shit and just making the enemies ridiculous. But and this is one thing, like if this DLC does well, in my opinion, for me personally at least, it's going to make a fuck ton of money. But if Shadow of the Erd Tree rekindles my faith in the game, I will continue being invested in From Software games moving forward. But if it doesn't, I might stop with their games. I'm kind of tired of them pushing the difficulty into a brick wall. And now that they're actually hitting that brick wall, I really I want them to change it up where it's not just a bunch of cheap robotic AI shit that makes the fight difficult with like ultra tracking, animation reading, animation punishing, all the bullshit things in Elden Ring that we hate, right? I don't want the difficulty to go in that direction anymore. I want them to make things more unique, instead of just enemy can input read every fucking thing you do and punish you for it. It's just, it's annoying. And I want the DLC to Elden Ring to not be annoying. I want it to rekindle my faith. I want to keep being invested in these games. But if they fuck it up, I might just quit and just play other games, which I've got a fuck ton of games to play anyway, so it's not like I need this. I'm probably not going to get the DLC yet. I'm playing Neo right now, and I'm exhausted of Elden Ring. Yeah. One thing I wonder, too, is how the DLC for Elden Ring is going to do, because Elden Ring was, like, the DLC for all the other games, I think, came out within a year of the games releasing. Like, I think Dark Souls 1 came out in 2011, DLC came out, I think, 2012. Dark Souls 2, 2014, and then DLC in 15. Dark Souls 3 and 16, and then 17. And I think Bloodborne had a 15, 16 for the base game and DLC. Elden Ring's had a long gap, because it came out in 2022 and the DLC is coming out 2 years later. That's a big gap. So it has to be really good, or it might fail, or it might fail to recoup the invested time in the game. For the DLC, anyway. Elden Ring made a fuck ton of money for that studio. They are sitting good right now. I actually thought about giving some of the other Souls like a try, just because I like the Souls likes, but they need to be good. Like Remnant from the Ashes, I really enjoyed. Had some problems with it, but really enjoyed it. I played the second one, and I just really fell off a cliff with wanting to play it. I didn't really find it bad either. I just didn't want to play it after a while. I like how we've gotten like 7 minutes into this video, and I'm talking about other games. They lost me so hard with Godskin Duo. I just don't understand how that gets passed off as a mandatory boss. Yeah, the Godskin Duo fight is really just them pushing their fucking limits with making that fight take forever. Like if you fought Like if you fought them similar to Ornstein and Smo, that could have been cool as sort of a callback. But the way you fight them is just so annoying, especially when you defeat both of them and there's still a massive health bar, and you have to defeat them again. Like you basically have to fight like 4 bosses in a row in one go, or restart the whole thing. It's just a waste of your time, like as a player. And that's something I'm going to bring up in my video that I'm working on. It's just Elden Ring wastes so much of your time because of the random difficulty bullshit they put in the late game. It's incredibly annoying. One of my friends said that this DLC better be fucking flawless. They've had a lot of time to refine it and shave off anything cheap. Yeah, and that's how I feel. It's just if this DLC like just continues the same shit as late game Elden Ring, I'm probably done with their games after this. But anyway, let's try to get through this video. I've been talking so much about like other shit. Damn.
The Old Hunters, however, answers so many questions left by the base game. Questions like, who was Gurman's apprentice? Where did the doll come from? Where did Bergenworth get the cord to ascend Rom? What did the Healing Church's experiments look like? Whatever happened to Ludwig? And furthermore, whatever happened to Lawrence? The main villain of the entire story.
I mean, I would counter everything he just said with like, who was this famed warrior that Sif was guarding the grave of? You know, what were these? What were where is the where was the other where was the fourth lord hinted at in the beginning? Because we saw, you know, life, death, light, and dark. Where was the fourth one that we missed? We gotta at least make it to Ludwig. Yeah, that's the thing. I'm gonna try to stream for another hour and a half, so we are getting somewhere. Damn it, we're gonna get somewhere. God help me. But like again, he's doing that thing where all these connections is like, yeah, all this stuff gives context to what happened in the base game, just like Dark Souls 1. I mean, if anything, I would say that the Dark Souls 1 DLC had a more lasting impact on that game's legacy than this game did, because you look up any Souls game content, you're probably going to find Sif and Artorias' story somewhere, right? That is a very much beloved story amongst the fandom, right? They love that shit. One, because it's a cute puppy guarding his master's grave, right? And we love that shit. Also Artorias is a good fight and Sif is a good fight. It's a pretty well-rounded package and a great From Software tragedy. But I don't know many people that take the Bloodborne stuff and keep it alive in the community for very long. I just think the staying power of that one story, regardless of all the other context the DLC provides, I think does add a lot to the overall package. Whereas this is just context for the church is horrible, the old ones are freaky, or not the old ones, but the like cosmic beings are freaky, and this fishing hamlet, basically got cursed. you know, it's just a lot of stuff that, yeah, it adds context, just like the Artorias DLC. Like again, it feels like that false equivalency where he's ignoring shit in Dark Souls 1 to make Bloodborne seem better, and I'm really tired of that. I don't think so. Mainly people refer to the gameplay of Bloodborne, and for Dark Souls 1, the lore is more notable for people. I mean, I think that's fair. I think Bloodborne, um, I think Bloodborne does have a more lasting impact because of its sort of some of the aesthetics of its combat. But I do think Dark Souls 1 has a bigger grip on people in this sort of Souls community for some of the lore. I think it's just because they did a lot of stories well, and it was kind of the first one where they were able to do a lot of the shit they wanted to with a DLC, since Demon Souls didn't have a DLC. So I think it's a thing where like I understand why people still talk about Bloodborne. That's why we're doing it right now, and why he talked about it. It's like all these games are interesting to talk about, and they're interesting on their own. I just find it interesting how the lore of one game kind of has lasted this long in people's hearts and minds for so long. And it's like I don't really remember anything lore wise from this DLC, even after watching lots of VOD videos about Bloodborne. It's just, it's like a Cthulhu, it's like a Lovecraftian tragedy. You know, doesn't really tug at the heartstrings that much. Conceptually, it's interesting, but it might be a thing where maybe I'm just biased towards the emotional weight of a lot of stuff in Dark Souls 1, which I think hit harder. And as you just put, Sheep, Solaire, Sigmire, Sif, and Artorias are my favorite storylines. When it comes to Bloodborne, I just don't feel as invested in the characters. And it's the same here. It's like there's not that many characters to invest in that go on a worthwhile journey. It's like now there are some things in Bloodborne that are notable that I think do stand out. Like I think Eileen stands out a little bit. Definitely Gascoigne and his whole like family story does stand out. Those are ones I would highlight as highlights. But everything else is very sort of it's sort of repetitive, I guess you would say, because like the gimmick of Bloodborne is that everyone's turning into a beast, right? And the threat is turning into a beast or turning into some cosmic monster. Either way, you're turning from a person into a monster, right? The same thing happens in Dark Souls 1 with hollowing. But the difference is the stories in Dark Souls 1 that you just mentioned, Sheep, Solaire doesn't go hollow necessarily. Like he basically just gets taken over by the sunlight maggot and kind of freaks out. Sigmire, I believe, does go hollow. I'm not 100% sure on his story, but Artorias dies to the player, and Sif guards his grave. Right, that has nothing to do with hollowing. That's just a good doggo, being there to watch his master's grave. Right, it's God, it's such a good premise for a story that just tugs at your heartstrings when you realize that in this timeline you killed his master and then you come back to kill him too. It's just sad. From Software needs to stop making us the bad guys. Like I want to stop being the guy that like kills, characters that, were just trying. They do end with a little hope or at least a sad ending that makes you feel something. In Bloodborne it just tends to be hopeless. Yeah, and that's one thing that I think was touched on in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. In that, I believe there's a note in that game talking about how the best way to farm fear from people is to give them a little ray of hope and then torture them more, because that hope um, keeps them thinking that things will get better, which makes the torture that much more horrible, right? If when people become hopeless, they have nothing to live for, and so they just become numb to everything. At which point, what Alexander's trying to do in Amnesia: The Dark Descent doesn't work anymore because he can't harvest the vitae, however you say it, when they're not afraid. If you're getting tortured every day, you're going to get numb to it when there's no hope of escape, right? You will just resign yourself to your fate and just die, right? Like that's your coping mechanism when there's no way out. And hope is a very important thing, it's the light and the dark are not quite so bright or dark without the other, right? And you need both of those to make things work. That's one reason why I've never been particularly interested in the Cthulhu stuff from a storytelling perspective. Is while the mythos is interesting, the hopelessness of it kind of turns me off to it. It's like, so what's the, and like I know the stories are kind of like, from what I gather, the point is basically, what's the point of worrying about these things if they're so far above us they could snap us out of existence in a second. If we can't do anything to change that and there is no hope for fighting against that, then what's the point in worrying about it? It's like we're gonna die anyway. It's like, I'm sorry, but when you say it like that, you just die. It's hilarious. I mean, when you die, you just die. I mean, like, yeah, it's just like, if you're gonna make a story about like pain and suffering, I think hope is an important element to remember, because when you make things hopeless, it seems so bleak to the point of, you know, why should I care, right? Because if there's no way out, then why should I care? You know, whereas if there is a small trace of hope, then you can actually like work around that and be invested in the characters. You know, like take any hero's journey. If you know the hero is going to fail the entire time, why would you reread the story? Like, or that's a bad way to put it. Why would you be invested in the journey if you know the hero is going to fail? Right? Like it's just it's not compelling as there is like just a tiny little hint of hope. But anyway, let's try to get back to this fucking video. I keep ranting about random shit. There was a little girl that gets eaten by a pig in the story. That could have been a long quest line that ends horribly. I know, right? Yeah. I mean, and Acer did bring it up where, you can't do anything to affect that quest line. It's got basically 3 stages. Meet little girl, tell her to go to Odin Chapel. She goes down and dies. And then other girl wants the ribbon that she had. And then you go and get it and bring it back. It's just could have been interesting. Could have been interesting. I mean, it is interesting on the face of it, but it's just such a blunt sort of we all die, deal with it, little girl dead. It's not like Solaire where you see him for such a long period of time throughout the game and you get attached to him so that when he finally does die, if the quest line progresses that way, it hits you because he's been with you throughout a lot of the game. And he's been a friendly, courteous, helpful individual. So you care. You care about him. Why does she even go alone? The lack of self-preservation is insane. I know, right? This stuff is just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, back to the video.
Bloodborne is incomplete without this DLC in a way Dark Souls just wasn't without it. And
Bloodborne is not incomplete. You get all the context you need for the story in the base game. This just gives you more context. Quit lying about Dark Souls 1 to make Bloodborne look better.
It was likely because FromSoft knew they were going to do an expansion. They were actually going to do 2 expansions, but they merged them together into this, that they felt confident saving up some of the main story to be used here. So much of what we're seeing here is not so much the new story, rather it's the missing piece to the puzzle. It has a lot of retcons in it, but even those mostly fit right into place with the rest of the game.
This is the one thing. I feel like he's going to talk about how this DLC matters a lot more. I feel like we're going to be in a thing where he's just going to repeat the same point over and over and over. So if he does, I might just ignore him because there's no point in me bringing up the exact same point over and over and over. Bloodborne is definitely not incomplete without the DLC. If anything, it makes the base game look worse in comparison. Yeah. There's also a thing his wording of retcons when discussing the DLC also makes it look worse. Because you don't have to retcon something unless you think the original idea is terrible or your new idea doesn't mesh with the old one. In any case, there's a problem. It's not like a recontextualization. That's different than a retcon. A retcon is like a change, right, from the way things worked in one thing from the way they work in another. That's just annoying. But like I said, if he makes the same point over and over, I'm just going to ignore it and let the video run.
Speaking of the rest of the game, the returning areas, mostly, are changed up a bit to play on the player's familiarity with them. Players should know how Cathedral Ward is laid out, so From Software was able to drop those muscle-like rock formations on it, assuming players have the wherewithal to open the shortcut back to the starting lantern. Likewise, in the darkened house near the cleric beast where we killed the wheelchair-bound Yarnamite near the beginning of the game, there are now explosives to punish players who think they're clever attacking the wheelchair man unprompted. There are also fights with enemies who throw delayed Molotov cocktails, which play on the familiarity with them from the base game. So the player needs to rethink how they approach a fight where these are employed.
I mean, I think it also helps that when you're in the house, you see these obviously strange things that you haven't seen before, like the little explodey barrel thingies. It's like they look different, and given how you can smack this guy, it's like I understand why they would set a trap like this to kind of throw you off, to keep you on your toes. That's good. It's just it does look different because you have these strange new apparatuses nearby. Because I don't think you see these in other places in the game before this. So I mean, it is a thing that looks different. You're suspicious of these new. I would be suspicious of new things appearing in the world, especially when they look like something that could potentially be some sort of device used for something. You know, like whenever I see something crowded around an item in a video game, I immediately get suspicious because it's like, do these things explode? Do they poison me? Do they hurt me in any way? Do they do anything to me? Like, I am suspicious now.
There are now explosives to punish players who think they're clever attacking the wheelchair man unprompted. There are also fights with enemies
I like how he was smart enough to trigger it and then just sit there in the corner and he still got hit anyway.
who throw delayed Molotov cocktails, which play on the familiarity with them from the base game. So the player needs to rethink how they approach a fight where these are employed. Suffice it to say, FromSoft put a lot of work into making this DLC.
Plus, the item looks too free. If the item is just out there, especially in a game like this, something is wrong. Yeah, it's suspicious. It looks suspicious.
Challenging without making difficulty the point. Much of the hard.
Wait a minute, what did he just say?
Suffice it to say, FromSoft put a lot of work into making this DLC challenging without making difficulty the point.
Okay, I thought he said something else, but yeah.
Much of the hardship here is brought about simply by the players once again being asked to go to the fundamentals and play cautiously. If I had to pick a single point to celebrate about the design of this DLC, it's that it wisely raises the stakes by varying the kinds of encounters rather than the difficulty of the encounters. It would have been
not using the optimal healing per his own words. I'm gonna keep bringing that up now just because I think it's funny.
Very easy to just litter the area with hard enemies, but taken on its own, nothing here is really that big of a step up from the base game. The encounters aren't that much harder, rather the framework around each of them veer into unknown territory, so players have to swallow their late game pride and go back to basics.
There's where that input reading started. I love how he shot the guy once and then just never tried to parry him again. Yeah. I think he ran out of bullets though, so let's be fair here. I think he did run out of bullets. I think he had like one when the fight started.
Follow them. Nothing here, just difficult stakes about the design cautiously, by the player's point.
Yeah, he had
much of the hardship.
He had one bullet when it started, so I'm not gonna rag on him too much for that. But that input reading of like the daggers, like 20 seconds later, I think was pretty funny.
So players have to swallow.
If you want to complain about input reading, this is where it began.
Late game
sort of.
Pride and go back to basics. The giant executioner's axes get after effects once they buff themselves, and that's an unknown element. The Gatling gun hunter likes to retreat to his dark cave, and not knowing the layout of that interior makes it an unknown. The beast hunter
You're not using the optimal healing. Okay, I'm gonna stop with the optimal healing BS he said earlier.
Outside of Gilbert's home has jump attacks, which makes you be cautious because what else might he have? There are many more such cases, but I think this point is made. The DLC also manages to almost solve the problem of the limited early game build variety. The introduction of the Beast's Embrace and Milkweed runes open up what you can do with your character, and since the DLC is accessible right after the game's first choke point boss has been defeated, you almost have a clear sailing to...
What the fuck did he just do? I gotta go back and watch this.
With your character, and since the DLC is accessible right after the game's first choke point
Target
boss
is
has
clearly
been defeated,
poisoned, waste poison knife. What the fuck are you doing? You're just not giving him a break on the optimal healing thing. This is the thing. I'm not going to give him a break on it because it's a stupid argument, but I'm not going to repeat it every time he like goes against his own ideology because this video would get tiresome, especially when he's dealing with an enemy like this. By the way, fuck this enemy. I hate this enemy. But also just that waste of a poison knife is just like, bruh, look at your footage.
Have a clear sailing to make your character branch far off right away. I say almost because the difficulty here is scaled to the late game, and because the runes are locked behind some of the game's strongest bosses. Ludwig closes out both, but on an extreme, you'd need to actually complete the entire DLC if you want to get really into Arcane with the Parasite of Cause. The Beast's Embrace rune is a bit more accessible, but a bit more accessible than the Parasite of Cause is still not my idea of accessible. I talked.
This is the problem with NPC hunters. They have access to infinite hunter tools, so they just sit there and spam stuff like that roar move. Yeah. That's the thing. When you use the roar move in the game, does it require bullets? I think it takes some resource, but I can't remember what. But yeah, just NPCs that have unlimited ammo for the shit they're using is really annoying.
About how the entire DLC would have been balanced around the smallest stamina bar and slowest stamina regeneration speed, but I haven't really talked all that much about stamina as a mechanic. So, rallying and blood vials function as a means of guiding the combat experience to be desperate, similar to how style meters in action games set the tone of the conflict in them. I've said as much already. Well, the stamina is in complete opposition to conventional character action games. Those often have bars fill up when the player performs successful hits, which the player can empty in exchange for some boon, a stronger form, or something like that. Bloodborne, technically speaking, has that in the form of the beast blood pellets.
I feel like that'll be a running joke throughout this series. Is just him not doing what he tells us to do, or what he said he believes they're built for. That'll be a fun running joke. Oh, look at that! We broke the 5-hour mark. Huzzah! We're getting there.
Which are admittedly consumables, but the draining stamina means players are not even given an option for endless combos. You need to duke it out. Every fight has to be a slugfest, regardless of how good you are at the game.
All right, I've been roasting him for stuff for too long. I need to actually go back and go over some of these points he's bringing up, because he brought up a lot of stuff, and I was just making fun of him for bullet use and wasting items and shit. I need to go back to the points he was actually making.
You want to get really into Arcane with the Parasite of Cause. The Beast's Embrace rune is a bit more accessible, but a bit more accessible than the Parasite of Cause is still not my idea of accessible. I talked about how the entire DLC would have been balanced around the smallest stamina bar and slowest stamina regeneration speed, but I haven't really talked all that much about stamina as a mechanic. So, rallying and blood vials function as a means of guiding the combat experience to be desperate, similar to how style meters in action games set the tone of the conflict in them. I've said as much already. Well, the stamina is in complete opposition to conventional character action games. Those often have bars fill up when the player performs successful hits, which the player can empty in exchange for some boon, a stronger form, or something like that.
And this is one thing he is talking about, different games doing the stamina system is integral to this system because it manages basically how you deal with enemies, right? Either between, depending on the game, either blocking, attacking, dodging, what have you, right? That's why the stamina bar is important in these games, because it drastically, the whole idea of a stamina bar managing your attacks and dodges impacts the entire system of this combat system, right? And that's part of the reason it has such a good flow, is because you can't dodge infinitely. You can't attack infinitely. You have to pick and choose when to do things, because you need time to rest in between, creating the rhythm of the overall combat. If this was a very different game, they'd have to balance things very differently if they did not have the stamina system sort of underpinning all of your actions in the game.
Bloodborne, technically speaking, has that in the form of the beast blood pellets, which are admittedly consumables, but the draining stamina means players are not even given an option for endless combos. You need to duke it out. Every fight has to be a slugfest, regardless of how good you are at the game. In Souls, the action was mostly directed by the stamina bar. Your ability to defend yourself and attack enemies in those games was predicated on your ability to make smart tactical decisions on which was the right option at what point. Here, the stamina's role is massively reduced, but it still serves some important functions. It puts a cap on our ability to stunlock enemies, since each hit drains a bit of our overall stamina, and it also asks us to be a bit economic with our dashes. I wonder how much playtesting went into proving enemies for low stamina players movement-wise, and I also wonder if that is the reason we have so much more mobility than every enemy but Logarius, rather than that having been a creative decision in its own right. It might seem like From Software actually always intended for the player to be as ridiculously mobile as they are here, compared to the preceding games, but game design is very often just a decision between two compromises, and if you've never programmed a game, you might be surprised by just how much of what makes it in is actually just a close aggregate of what was intended. I'm opening up the shortcut to the lantern now, so it's time to talk about Simon. Simon, I noted, serves a similar purpose in this DLC to what Elizabeth did in Dark Souls. I also noted that I think Elizabeth's placement was better because she gave the player their heading right away, and I maintain that that is true. I actually think Simon being tucked away like he is sort of a cool hook, since it makes him appear more mysterious, but regardless, having him at the start would probably be a better way to direct this experience.
I've used Eileen as an example of what I consider good quest design, considering how Bloodborne plays, and I really like her. But when it comes to pure craftsmanship, I think Simon kinda blows everyone else out of the water, and I'm not sure it's even close.
That's one thing. I have no idea what this guy's quest line is, if he even has one. So I'm kind of just going off of whatever Acer shows me at this point and whatever you guys tell me. So I don't really know much about this character at all, really. So inform me if Acer's saying something stupid.
I know I'm comparing apples to oranges here, but seeing an NPC which is so well integrated with the natural progression of the game is a really pleasant sight. Simon will teleport to meet us on our journey, so encountering him is organic, not tied to going through two loading screens to meet him and two loading screens to get back to where we are in the game, like it is for the dwellers in Eden Chapel.
Or going anywhere in general in this game. Again, warping from lantern to lantern should have been a thing. That should have been a really easy thing to implement. I don't know why they force you back to the hub.
Simon tells us that there is a secret which the church wants kept, and that if we choose to advance, we might discover just what it is. The DLC and the main game are these sorts of eldritch mystery stories, but only the DLC had the good sense to actually frame its narrative as such from the get-go and continually hammer home that that is the point. If the main game had had an NPC to continually drive home that the player is supposed to be uncovering the mystery of the Menses ritual, I imagine it would have played much clearer, and I know that it used to work like that because data miners have found that Mikolash used to fill that role. In an early
All right, let me go back to this mystery.
point, narrative as such from the get-go and continually hammer home that that is the point. If the main game had had an NPC to continually drive home that the player is supposed to be uncovering the mystery of the Menses ritual, I imagine it would have played much clearer, and I know that it used to work like that because data miners have found that Mikolash used to fill that role. In an earlier build,
This is one thing. This is one thing too about what he just said about like the having some guy telling you to investigate the mysteries of the main game. I think that it takes away from a mystery when you have a guy going over and over, "Hey, there's something strange going on." It's like we can tell. Like you don't need an NPC sitting around saying, "Hey, the church did some weird shit. It's like we know, we can tell, we can read the items, listen to the NPCs, we can figure it out. We don't need an NPC telling us, hey, weird shit's going on, go this way.
He would tell the players to go to Bergenworth, and at some point he would go crazy and summon the Red Moon. After that, we would eventually chase him in Hemwick. Remember how I said Hemwick was once where you built your character? Where he would jump into the ocean, which was illuminated by the Red Moon, and he would become the boss of the Nightmare of Mensis. There was also a build where the narrative was propelled by the players searching for their friend Lawrence, no relation to the Lawrence of the Healing Church. As is, to quote channel friend and Bloodborne master Richard Pilbeam, the narrative propels because doors unlock. And instead of having a consistent NPC who anchors our experience to a specific thematic vision, we go from one NPC to another in hopes of figuring out what is going on. Simon is not any more complex design-wise than a character like Eileen, but I like him more because he does that thing we talked about earlier. His story is adjusted to the way in which the game plays, rather than being a story which asks the player to conform to it, to...
All right. We can also look at the literal sea of blood on the ground to know something's going on, or how the beasts literally cower in fear of you. Yeah, it's like having NPCs follow you around, you know, saying investigate the mystery kind of makes you not want to investigate when someone tells you to do it over and over. It's like going to the bathroom and someone constantly tells you, hey, you need to go to the bathroom. Hey, you need to go to the bathroom. Hey, you need to go to the bathroom. It's like, I have to go to the bathroom anyway. I'm going to do this anyway. You don't have to tell me to do it. It's like, have a little faith in my ability to like do shit. You know, but going back to talking about Simon's quest line here, let's just see what he has to say on it.
Earlier. His story is adjusted to the way in which the game plays, rather than being a story which asks the player to conform to it, to go out of their way to uncovering it. In terms of the material rewards which you get for completing it, Simon's quest is not nearly as valuable as Alfred's or Eileen's, but because he is so much more convenient, I'd wager that players see his story through more often. I repeat myself, but some games excel at some things and not other things.
Whoa, revolutionary. Some games are better at some things than others. Holy shit. This bastion of critical analysis truly has the greatest mind-blowing content of all time. I'm just being a pretentious prick, but come on, man. Like, have a little more faith in like your viewership. His story is literally insignificant. You get all of his shit by killing him. Yeah, it's just underwhelming. It's just, it's, I don't know. Again, it's that thing where I think he just likes Bloodborne a lot and wants to gush about things he thinks it does uniquely, when sometimes it's not something it does uniquely, or it's something other games have done better. I mean, it feels like he's played the crap out of Bloodborne, and he's played like all the other games maybe like once. Because like you can pick up on a lot of the shit that he says that's just blatantly wrong about other games. And just his comparisons are really like almost all the times he's compared Dark Souls 1 to this game, they've been off, where he's misrepresented something in Bloodborne, misrepresented something in Dark Souls 1, or he's just outright lied about something in Dark Souls 1. And that just bugs the fuck out of me. It's like, why is it so hard for people to be honest on the internet? Why is it so hard? Why?
And it is very rarely a good idea to lean on a game's weakness to prop it up. Unless you really like dialogue, Bloodborne is bad at making the player invest the time the loading screens take to warp them to the Cathedral Ward Lantern, to access the chapel dwellers Eileen and Alfred. What Bloodborne is really good at, though, is keeping the player tunneling deeper into its levels. So it makes more sense for NPCs to travel with the player rather than ask the player to backtrack to meet them.
Now, that is one thing I would say is a fair point about Bloodborne, is that you can kind of roam around Bloodborne without having to, have any sort of significant rest time in between, right? Just because enemies drop vials relatively consistently, that does add to like active play time, right? Where you can just keep on a trucking. You reach a lantern, you flick it on or whatever you do to turn it on, and then you just keep on going. Don't have to warp, don't have to rest, don't have to reset enemies, don't have to stop. That is one boon of the game, and that does, and it would help to have NPCs that move around with you as opposed to having to go through loading screens to get back to them. So that point he just made, I would agree with.
Might not be as realistic, but it plays better, and playing well usually matters more than realism. Usually. Not always. My apologies to anyone watching if the darkness makes it hard to keep track of the action. If I want to maximize my damage output, I can't be holding the torch, and since I didn't buy the little lantern from the messengers in the dream, you'll just have to tolerate this for a little while longer. It's sort of been the holy grail of FromSoft games since Dark Souls 2 reneged on this promise to have areas with such immense darkness that it forces players to actually have to select between using shields or torches. Bloodborne's darkness is not as deep as Dark Souls 1's could be at times, so this isn't as big a gameplay mechanic in this game either. I think the problem with promising these sorts of areas and always pulling back on them is that the idea of trading visibility for defense, or in the case of Bloodborne, offense, feels incredibly grating as a localized challenge. It's not really in the spirit of the way FromSoft does things to make sure players have the choice, since picking up light sources is always optional, but I think this idea is tenable.
Yeah, again, infinite bullets. And that's one thing too, is like it's a difference between, like, there's a difference between the guy with the like Gatling gun walking around versus Jura with his like machine gun on top of something. Like, he's camped out with ammo, right? You could believe that, right? This guy's just walking around with like a bajillion bullets in his pockets, just like, bruh, give me a break. But we need to go back a little bit, see this point he's making.
A localized challenge. It's not really in the spirit of the way FromSoft does things to make sure players have the choice, since picking up light sources is always optional, but I think this idea is tenable. Not necessarily in an area of a game, but rather if it was a central mechanic to a game, much like how the pistols are here. If the entire game was built on the idea that the players would be periodically trading visibility for safety, then it would probably come out better in playtesting than I imagine little areas like the one here do. Dark Souls 1 flew closest to the sun when it came to delivering on this, and as time goes on, I've noticed more and more people have come around to the idea that the Tomb of the Giants is actually one of that game's better levels. So,
Nah. This tells me that he's either talking to one specific side of the community, or he's not taking into account other people's perspectives other than his own. H Bomber guy did this a lot when he was doing his quote unquote defense of Dark Souls 2. Yeah, look at that. He didn't need to reload a single time. He still has a strong melee moveset too. It's like, yeah. But getting back to what the point I was making about this, Tomb of the Giants is one of From Software's most gimmicky levels because it severely limits what you can do. And it's a thing, even when you have prior knowledge to what is best to use in that area, you're still limiting your options, right? And that's the problem with darkness as a challenge, right? Like, and this one thing where if you had something like Dark Souls 2 with Tomb of the Giants, where you had a torch you could have, and it gave you it at the beginning of the level, and it allowed you to light like certain like little sconces along the pathway throughout Tomb of the Giants, I think that would make the gimmick of the level more interesting, make it more dynamic, and also make it easier for you in a realistic sense. As it stands now, you walk around in the dark where you either have to sacrifice a head item, which could potentially, give you more souls, greater stamina regen, more health, extra equip load, what have you, amongst all the headgear that gives you bonuses, right? You sacrifice that, or you sacrifice a weapon slot, right, to light your way forward. Or you walk around in the dark and run the risk of getting pancaked by the skeletons or falling off a ledge and dying. The Tomb of the Giants is not one of From Software's best levels, right? There are significant hampers to the way the combat works in the game. Not to mention when you have to do it in the dark with the upright skeletons, but the dog skeleton things too, right? There is a lot of cancer in that area if you think that you can do it without a light source, right? And even doing it with a light source is cumbersome, right? It's I'd argue it's one of the worst areas in the game. I don't think it's outright terrible, but it definitely limits a lot of shit that you can do, and it's incredibly annoying to deal with. It's a lot more sloppy in its design as well. It definitely betrays the hard but fair mentality when you have a pit of large skeletons. Yeah, that section of it's awful, you know. Or you're a mage and found the obscure vendor that will let you buy a spell that serves as a light source. Yeah, it's like, unless you have very, very specific things, that encounter can become very annoying very quick. Right? And it's something you can't get over. Right? Like if you like a good example is if you're playing Dark Souls 1 and you don't want to have to deal with the lantern and you're not a spellcaster, which just by law of like uh law of variability, like there's a high chance that you would not be a spellcaster. Like you have to go to Lost Izalith, complete that basically that whole area to get the sunlight maggot, so you can actually have a light source on your head where you don't have to trade out your weapon or shield, or whatever slots you have in each of those things, right? Like you need to go that way to have an ample light source. Otherwise, you're going to have to invest into a stat that may not be appropriate for your build to get the spell that casts a light, or you're going to have to sacrifice a weapon slot, to produce light so you can see shit. And even then, it only works when you're holding it up, right? So it fucks up whenever you start using like your weapons and get knocked around, right? It's a cumbersome area with a serious amount of problems, especially when you get to some of the more ganky areas in there where they put like four giant skeletons next to each other. It's just, it's ridiculous. Yeah, it's like at the expense of Solaire or 40 humanity, both of which, depending on how you play, are too expensive. It's like, yeah, it's ridiculous to go through there if you don't know what you're doing, right? And that's one reason why whenever I play the game, I always try to go to Lost Izalith before that area, just because the Sunlight Maggot is the best alternative, right? If you don't have the spell. It's also a thing too, like the spell slot even to have the light is also ridiculous because you use the spell slot for a limited time of light, right? And then you lose a spell slot, which you could put anything else more useful. It's cumbersome for almost every damn player on the planet to go through that area. It is not one of From Software's best areas, especially not in that game. Anyway, let me go back here. I've been talking so much. We made it about 20 minutes, which is at this rate is pretty common for this stream. Is that he brings up a point, I go on a rant for 20 minutes, and then we continue.
Dark Souls 1 flew closest to the sun when it came to delivering on this, and as time goes on, I've noticed more and more people have come around to the idea that the Tomb of the Giants is actually one of that game's better levels. So I think we might get more experimentations with this in the future, either from Software or someone else, but as is, we make do with what we get.
Again, going back to Amnesia: The Dark Descent, a good use of darkness and light is in the way that you manage your sanity meter in that game. Your character, if you go too insane, you will basically fall over, and basically go nuts, right, from just fear. But you alleviate that by lighting candles and shit like that. So it's like, you can manage darkness as a way to affect you mechanically if you do it appropriately given the game. Like, again, I think a Dark Souls 2 style system where you can light up dark areas is not a bad idea, right? I just think Dark Souls 2 didn't implement it very well. Now, granted, I don't think it did a terrible job either, but it could have been better. And I think this whole thing of dealing with darkness in these games is an interesting concept, but they often fuck it up most of the time. And this is one thing where this game and Elden Ring kind of had the same solution with having, a torch that you can hold or having something you equip on like your belt or whatever that just lights up the area without you sacrificing anything, which I think is the optimal way to do it as far as I've seen so far in this series, right? It's a good system. It works, lights up enough of the area, but not all of it. And you don't sacrifice any gear or weapon slot. I think it works pretty well, so, but again, they may not do shadow stuff that much anymore. By the way, the Gatling gun pretty much fucking sucks. Go us, right? I know. Why don't we get infinite ammo? Who could have guessed that gun meant to mulch bullets doesn't work in the hands of a player who can't cheat with infinite ammo? Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like when you get a boss weapon and then it doesn't do like the boss weapon type shit that you expected it to do. Like when I got Gwen's sword, I thought it was going to be on fire. It was going to look so awesome when swinging it. No, it's just a sword. It's just like any old sword, just a great sword. It's nowhere near as cool as you would hope it would be. At least the Artorias sword actually gets a proper move set. It actually gets a proper Artorias-like move set. So like 80% of Souls game boss weapons. Yeah, pretty much. Now, this is one thing. Dark Souls 3 did do a really good job of making a lot of the boss weapons kind of cool. But it's also a thing where Elden Ring kind of took this to 11 with a lot of the boss weapons. Like Melania's weapon allows you to do waterfowl dance, obviously with reduced damage and reach, and stuff like that. But there's a lot of cool ideas that are really hard to balance. So I kind of get why they wouldn't let you do everything. But it would have been nice to have like boss weapons do more shit in these earlier games.
In general, it seems like environmental challenges flow better when players are responding to them in the moment rather than when they need to fundamentally alter their approach. I like both, but stuff like responding to Jura targeting us with a Gatling gun in Old Yarnum goes down easier for most players than being challenged to rethink how to play.
I mean, it's one thing too that he's doing is like he's talking about like he's showing footage of fighting this guy and he continually makes the decision to back away from the guy with the gun. It's like that's the one thing you don't want to do when you're trying to kill a guy with a gun when you don't have a gun. It's like you need to get closer. It's like holy shit. Reduced damage, reach, doesn't heal you at all, no poise whatsoever. I am probably the biggest hater of that weapon. That's the thing. The regular weapon itself is kind of nice because it's a super long katana style weapon with with like bleed on it, but it's like it should do Scarlet rot damage and it should have a little bit more like it should give you health back, like a small percentage of it's just not a good weapon. It's one of those things where the weapon is not worth the torment to get it, right? You have to beat the hardest boss in the fucking game to get a weapon with a weapon art that is not nearly as good as any of the other like major weapons in the game, right? Like Malekith's weapon art is fucking fantastic, right? Like when you get his greatsword, it's a greatsword with Destined Death on it that gives an AoE move with splash damage. That is fantastic, right? That's one of my grade A weapons when fighting in Elden Ring. Like if I'm doing like a boss run build, right? That is a fantastic weapon. This weapon, you got to beat the hardest boss in the fucking game. By that point, you've probably killed everything else, and most of the enemies are going to poise through your damage anyway or knock you down before you can finish the wind up. It's just so underwhelming. Like the most overpowered boss should give the most overpowered weapon. It's like, sorry, but that's the way it should be. Given her difficulty, her weapon should mulch PvE. Yeah, I should be able to shred everyone, but her with just L2. Yeah, Malekith's weapon is so good. My favorite holy weapon in the entire game. I'd argue it's the best weapon in the game. The best melee weapon anyway. I don't know about spells particularly yet, but I think Malekith's weapon is the best overall weapon in the game. Just that AoE. That's the thing. It gets all the advantages of being a heavy weapon, along with doing Destined Death damage, which affects every boss fairly evenly, on top of having a splash damage effect added to hit multiple targets with it. Like it's just a fantastic weapon. Also, Malekith is probably he's either my first or second favorite boss in that game. It's either him or Radon. Both of their boss encounters are really fucking cool, in my opinion. I don't like the first phase of Malekith, though. So that is a caveat. I like fighting Malekith, not the beast clergyman. I actually hate the beast clergymen, but that's an argument for another day. I wouldn't even blame you. Destined Death is incredible, and since it's tied to faith, you're going to have buffs as an option too. Yeah, Destined Death is such a great counteraction to so many bosses bullshit. Like whenever I fight Melania, I oftentimes have the Malekith weapon, and I just weapon art her ass over and over because it does enough poise damage to A, knock her down, B, does a fuck ton of damage to her with the initial attacks, C, destroys her poise if she's doing something else, and C, it's got a great fucking Destined Death effect. It's just amazing. Anyway, back to Bloodborne. Back to Bloodborne.
Another one of those challenges, which we get a lot of in these games, are areas which deal status ailments. Bleeds and poisons have on occasion been incorporated into environments to redirect the player's approach to be something more cautious, but for most of their presence, they serve as little more than an inconvenience.
And this is one thing I very much agree, Sheep. I hate clergymen so much. They should have had a full fight with Malekith. I don't know why he has to transform. It's like, I feel like they just had two different boss ideas and just splurged them together just to make it work. It's like, why? Yeah, but with what Acer's talking about like status ailments and things being sort of environmental challenges to overcome, most of the time they are pretty manageable, or at the very least, they're not too cumbersome. You know, like Blighttown is particularly picked on. And pretty much every poison swamp level is particularly picked on. But I mean, Blighttown's poison's pretty slow unless you get like the toxic, like the beefy poison from the dart shooters. You know, but even then, they drop the cure for it, and the poison does little damage very slowly over a long period of time, right? You know, like, so there are ways to get around it, even if you don't really know all the cheap ways to get around it, like finding, you know, the Ring of the Evil Eye to restore health and whatnot. You know, there are ways around it, basically. It's just a matter of people realizing what those ways, you know, are, for lack of a better term. And even then, the toxic darters stay dead. So if you kill one, you are always making progress. Yeah, and that's one thing that I think is a common thing that should be brought, or is a thing that should be brought back more often, is, you know, one-time enemies that go away. You know, because when you fight like an annoying enemy in Elden Ring and then they respawn, you're like, God, will you fuck off? It's like, you know, at that point, you just disengage from combat altogether and you just try to run past them, you know, which negates the whole point of having the combat system of the enemy, you know. But anyway, getting back to Bloodborne.
Almost like they are trying to justify the creation of antidotes rather than making antidotes because the player needed a difficulty release valve once confronted with poison. Bloodborne, like many CRPGs, often leans on stat management as a means of containing the experience, so many of its mechanics seem brought over because of convention rather than because they made sense. Often, the experience is guided by putting the stats under the hood, but since Bloodborne's most significant mechanics are presented visually, many of the hidden mechanics, like serrated versus righteous damage, go missed by many players. As it relates to status ailments, the purpose of poisonous areas in FromSoft games seems to be to make players map out a path through the islands of safety in the poisoned liquids. In practice, areas which inflict status ailments work best when you make yourself pretend like they are a problem, because the poison is never serious enough that you can't just take the damage.
I never realized there was like a blood-starved beast in here. It's kind of neat.
If they were, they would feel very unfair because the player might not immediately understand the solution to their problem. And dark areas can feel very similar. If you don't know the solution, those sorts of areas can feel more like meat grinders than challenging levels, and dying here feels unfair because you didn't feel like you made a mistake. If Jura killed you in Old Yarnum, that was fair game. You had all the time in the world to test out his line of sight and make decisions on advancing. But status ailments are just a clock ticking down to your death, and darkness is just a way for the designers to rob you of the visual information you need to make good decisions. Both kinds of areas might make an excellent hook if they were more central to the experience of the game, but as detours, they often come across as slogs to get through.
Yeah, that's one thing that I would kind of agree with him on, is like sometimes these things are just added on just to make things harder when they don't really need to be. Case in point, all the Scarlet Lake rot in Elden Ring is like, that's fucking stupid. Like, why do we have to have that shit? It's just Poison's really steroided up, older, like, brother. And it's really annoying. Yeah, it's one thing when the strong enemies are being reused to reflect growth, but some shouldn't respawn, like, ever. It's like, yeah, like, some enemies, like, are so strong that I think there is an argument to be made that they should despawn after you defeat them. Especially if they're in, like a really annoying area of the game.
I sympathize with people who dislike these sorts of areas, but as I've noted before, I'm kind of a fan of when games willingly grind against their cores to deliver something a bit different. So I always kind of like these dark areas. Now that I'm in the DLC, I'm going to be shifting up my build gradually by replacing my serrated weapon with the Whirligig Saw, which will also have great strength scaling, and my current strength weapon, Ludwig's Holy Blade, is gonna get traded for the real thing because of its arcane properties. The area right after also gives me the Black Sky Eye and the Milkweed Rune, and although I won't be using those a lot, I'm going.
Please get to Ludwig Acer. I'm begging you. We're trying. We're getting there. Oh yeah, we're close. We're like about 5 minutes away. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Going to fetch them because I've more or less exhausted what I can say about my current setup. What's funny about Arcane, and this always felt like an afterthought to me, is that it's a magic system which draws on Quicksilver bullets, just like the pistols do. It makes a certain amount of sense if you consider that a shared energy source means players will likely devote themselves more to one utility, and therefore this makes arcane builds somewhat distinct. But early builds of Bloodborne had an MP bar, so this didn't always used to be the case. I've noted Miyazaki's love of Fumito Ueta's Eco, and the reason we know about this is because he has cited that game as the reason he quit being an account manager for Oracle and took a pay cut to enter the game business. And the philosophy which Fumito Ueda is best known for is minimalism. Ueda has described the construction of his games like the pruning of trees, where non-essential elements get cut in order to prop up the significance of every other element. We don't know if the decision to remove the mana bar was made to align the game with the philosophy of Miyazaki's favorite game designer, but consciously inspired by Ueda or not, this line of reasoning might still have been what made the cut happen. That a bar.
I got no idea what he's talking about right now, but I just want to ask, why is he summoning someone when he's got no health, no ammo, and he just interacted with a lantern? It's like, couldn't you just go and like reset your resources real quick and like come back to grab more shit? I don't get that. Seems like a waste of insight.
Line of reasoning might still have been what made the cut happen. That a bar should not be in place unless it is going to be used by more than one build, so that there isn't any unnecessary clutter on screen. If you've ever played Dark Souls 3, you might remember that the mana bar there was also used to fuel the weapon arts, which were available for every build. It's also possible that the mana bar was removed because it just didn't play well, or because it was never intended to be used, and the one data miners found was just a placeholder until the Quicksilver bullets were implemented. In any case, I like the setup as is conceptually, but find it to be a bit hit or miss when playing. Balancing magic has always been a bit problematic for these games, since magic just seems to not want to be integrated into the core combat, which, fair enough. But as
I mean, I think that's kind of a stretch. It's like these are primarily melee focused games, but that doesn't mean you can't have, ranged magic combat, be a significant aspect of the combat, Like, this is one thing that I think the games have expanded upon as they've gone on, but I do think that you can go back to even as far as I think some bosses in Demon Souls had this too, but it's like Dark Souls 1 is a good example where you have magic inclined bosses, like Manus, for example. He's a really good example. He has some magic abilities that it would help for you to be away from the boss and fight him with magic, even when he uses magic. Another good example is Gwendolyn, running away, shooting spells at you. Sometimes having range helps with that. Even though he might be resistant to magic, he's not immune to it, right? It's one of those things that, it's just a thing where, like magic has been implemented better and better as the series goes on, but the difficulty spikes or the difficulty changes they make to the AI is hindering it as well. So we've got kind of two different roads going at the same time, and they keep intersecting and leading to a car crash. So like it's, we've got two systems that could work on their own, but they don't work well with each other, and that kind of screws up a lot of the combat with magic in later games when the enemies can dodge a whole lot or they read your inputs super well. And yeah, Sheev, I did see that. He's just wasting stuff at this point. I don't get why.
Janky as it is here,
Yeah, and then he sent him home. It's like, what the fuck are you doing?
I gotta say, when the arcane build starts rolling, it's a really fun build with a ton of great options. Not much to say right now about what's coming, but note that the snail woman falls from above. Throughout this DLC, we've been following a river of blood. It started out as comparatively understated, but at this point it's become the central visual of the environmental design. The upcoming fight against Ludwig is based on the Buddhist hell, as is much of this expansion. A central tenet of Buddhism is the idea that life is suffering and that in the cycle of resurrection, all creatures are made to suffer forever except if they obtain enlightenment. Incidentally, Bloodborne's story is literally a cycle, unless you're able to ascend to the next stage of evolution and leave behind everything that made you, you.
Yeah, talk about that thing for a minute. I like how that one dead guy or that one bloody guy he killed, he consistently drops 5 vials, or at least a varied amount of vials. I think he's programmed to consistently give you a decent amount of vials because he's next to Ludwig, and I do appreciate that. It's from saying, hey, we want you to fight this boss, and we want you to be prepared. So that is a nice detail before the fight, is that that little guy continues to give you a lot of shit that's useful. Yeah, but when you give bosses these overtuned AI buffs, that tends to fuck over melee builds too, and it doesn't feel good at all to deal with. That's also true. That's also true. And I read these comments out of order, but I'll get to them. Sorcery should always be easy when it comes to progressing an area, but struggle when it comes to bosses, seeing as how bosses are melee heavy. Oh yeah, and you can just use the Hunter's Mark over and over to farm the vials. Yeah. Yeah, but like again, it's one of those things, like sorcery needs to be balanced appropriately, and sometimes they do it well, and sometimes they don't do it well, and sometimes they can have a mix of both of those in the same game. Like I think Elden Ring is a good example. There's a lot of useful magic in there, but there's a lot of instances of the AI making useful magic useless. So it's a really hard way to balance things, especially when you have to account for melee combat as well. I mean, personally, I just break it up where you have bosses have, if it's appropriate, have bosses have ranged attacks, and then those ranged attacks, they use them when they're dealing with an enemy that does range shit. Now obviously some bosses I don't think should have ranged attacks. Like the rune bears in Elden Ring, having that little like air burst move they do, that's fucking stupid. They're giant bears. Why would they be able to do that? It's like, what the hell? You just made an annoying enemy more annoying. But anyway, let's get to Ludwig. We're almost there.
The Buddhist hell is where those wicked in life are sent to be tortured by demons, and the blood river flowing through the nightmare is here to give the image of a hellscape.
Because it originates from Ludwig's boss arena, A strong theory is that Ludwig himself is based on Mezu,
a horse-faced demon whose role it is to punish the wicked in hell as well as to guard it from within. So, if someone were to make their way to the entrance to hell and try to escape, Mezu and his ox-headed friend Gosu would be the ones to send that prisoner right back into hell.
All right, now one thing I'm hoping here is that he's not going to talk about Buddhist crap while, no offense to Buddhist followers, but I hope he's not going to talk about Buddhism while we're fighting Ludwig here. He's like one of the most memorable fights in the whole fucking game. Please don't skirt over him like you did Rom. I doubt it. That sounds like Japanese mythology, and this seems to take place in some sort of area like London. Yeah, I'm not really paying attention to what he's talking about with the Buddhist thing. I'm just, again, I don't care about the peripheral stuff. I want to talk about the game, what's in the game, and how it functions in the game and the game's lore. I don't care about where it came from. Okay, but this is one of the things. I hope he talks about Ludwig as a fight.
A role which Ludwig fills ludologically, since he's the big stumbling block to anyone attempting to reach the core of the nightmare. The way hell works in Buddhism is that in life you accumulate karma, and your stay in hell will reflect this karma, with each realm getting progressively more horrifying and you having to stay progressively longer in each. Your karma weighs you down, and the path you take in hell is determined by that weight. On the Sansu River, there are 3 paths to cross, and your path is determined by your karma threshold.
Yeah, that's one thing that's always a neat detail about the bosses is when they have stuff they bring up in later phases. And that is a cool detail that his sword is on his back. But he's still talking about Buddhism during this fight. Hey, sir, it is Ludwig. Talk about his fight. I know. Talk about the fight, not where the idea may have possibly come from.
And unlike
mechanics, talk about the mechanics.
Christianity, there's no priest to alleviate you of sin or last-minute confession. Buddhism goes all in. Truly, it's the Dark Souls of afterlives.
Okay, he died there, so maybe he's saving that for an actual fight. But
the fight against Ludwig is one of the toughest in the game.
Here we go.
So the corpse banging on the gate outside will drop 5 blood vials every time he's killed. Just so the economics of retrying this fight aren't as steep as they are for many other bosses. I've made my metric of a quality Bloodborne boss known already, and I've also made it apparent that I'm a normie.
I'll tell you where his design came from. Him and his horse. It said that he was fused with his horse, and that gives him his appearance. That's all you need, right? I always wonder about channels. I'm going to rant about this real quick, and then we'll get back to the Ludwig fight. But one thing that always annoys me about channels like this is that they talk about all the philosophy and all this like hairy-fairy, artsy-fartsy shit, and they don't actually talk about what what we want them to talk about, which is like the actual thing we have, with the context of why they are the way they are from the thing that we're talking about. It feels like a lot of people just like to brag about knowledge they have or like references they've found, and it's one thing, like sometimes you do find interesting references like through things, like there is a reference to to like a book and a movie in Dying Light, right, about a mentally disabled man. Like it's kind of a neat little thing to find if you're in the know, right? But here he's just talking about Buddhism and its like religious aspects compared to like a boss fight in a video game that doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism. It's really weird. It's less of an analysis and more of theories and possibilities. Yeah, it's one of those things that really kind of undermines the whole point of talking about this stuff, in my opinion. That's one reason why I don't talk about like previous versions of a game, kind of a thing. Like I don't talk about development that often. It's just because I don't think there's a point to talk about it, if it doesn't lead anywhere. There's no point to talk about, a story if it doesn't lead anywhere. Or, an idea if it doesn't go anywhere, Anyway, back to this fight.
So, surprise, surprise, this is my favorite fight in the entire game. It does a lot of things right, considering what I like about bosses in Bloodborne.
And here's one thing. He says it does a lot of things right as he proceeds to get body blocked and smacked by the single boss. Now, I like Ludwig as a fight, but the huge enemies flopping and flapping around, that does get annoying.
But more than that, it ties the gameplay and narrative together in very interesting ways. I already noted how he's lootologically what blocks the inhabitants of Hell from escaping, but there are lore-related happenings under the hood here which make the fight all that more interesting. Like, serrated weapons only deal extra damage in the first half of the fight because Ludwig awakens from the beasthood in the second half. When we first see Ludwig, his horse head seems to be almost paralyzed, and
Just that comment's making me laugh so much. No, god damn it. Don't go back to talking about hell and lore.
lame, and the arcane mouth eye head to the side seems to be the active head. The intent with this fight is that Ludwig is torn between beasthood and his humanity, and that seeing his sword is what awakens him to his senses. The fight is one of the fiercest in the game, and it really capitalizes on Ludwig's insane physiology without ever coming across as unfair. If you get behind him, he'll do a back kick, which makes sense because he's a horse. His charge attacks are easy to dodge if you can see them coming, and his jump attack is also quite manageable once you've seen him do it a couple of times. The optimal strategy in the first half is to fight him like you would any other beast, so fire and serrated. If serrated is an option, which it isn't for me because my Holy Blade is much higher upgraded, but the second half of the fight I find more interesting because his visual design becomes the biggest hurdle. If you think of him as a giant horse monster, you can trick yourself into reading his attacks wrong. The point of the mid-fight transformation is that he's no longer a beast, so you should look at him as you do any other giant swordsman. Ignore.
Yeah, that's one thing is like counter damage in this fight is where you really start to see them pushing the limits of how much damage a boss can deal in one hit. You know, and that drop attack is ridiculous. It also doesn't help that you can't see him. Right? That's the most annoying part. I don't care if the blood's dripping where he is. It's like it's still hard to see him, right? And that makes the fight almost unfair in a way. Like you could make a decent argument about why some consider that to be an unfair attack, especially with how much damage it does.
The point of the mid-fight transformation is that he's no longer a beast, so you should look at him as you do any other giant swordsman. Ignore his back-kicking legs, they aren't active in this phase. Don't worry about his charges or jump attacks, those are gone, as is his arcane-spewing second head. And the paralyzed horse head now has a determination on its face. I noted a line from Miyazaki a while back which went, "The urge to transform into a beast is in conflict with the basic sense of humanity we all have."
The charge attack will clear 80% of your HP, meaning you're either full health or dead on a failed dodge. Yeah, it's just really unrelenting. Also, Vic in here saying, he said the moonlight thing. Yeah.
That humanity serves as a kind of shackle, keeping the transformation in its place. The stronger the shackle, keeping that urge to transform in place is, the larger the recoil once that shackle is finally broken. The results cause you to transform into a larger creature, or a more twisted one. The struggle between these two urges is one concept here. You see that pretty clearly with the beast characters designed early on, especially the cleric beast, which serves as their icon of sorts. That connects with the idea that the cleric is really the most fearsome beast of them all. The cleric beasts are just beasts who kept a lid on their beasthood for a while longer, and that because they held on, the eventual transformation was all the more horrifying for it. This is why
I like how he talked about the fight for about the actual like mechanics of the fight for about 40 seconds, and then he goes back into the lore again. It makes me want to work on like a video talking about mechanics. That's one thing. It's like I love talking about mechanics in video games because there's so much to talk about in terms of how you play a game, and it's interesting. And it's like not to say the lore isn't interesting, but when you're in a fight that a lot of people love because of the mechanics of it and the aesthetic of it, and you talk about the aesthetic of it more than the mechanics, it just infuriates me. It's like I want to talk about the fight and the way the fight works, but then we don't get to. It's like why?
The eventual transformation was all the more horrifying for it. This is why bosses like Vicar Amelia are as horrifyingly large as they are. Following that line of thinking, Ludwig must have held on longer than anyone else in the game because, man, is he not just the most horrifying design in the entire game? In the Amelia fight, I talked about how characters at certain points are shown to be able to push back the encroaching beast to it. Gilbert has a cut line from a cut quest where he rejoices that he's been...
All right, I want to go back and show some things. But yeah, this sucks, man. He shouldn't have even showed the gameplay because it's way more exciting to watch Ludwig work. It's like, yeah. Oh man, again, it's skirting over the reason we play games. It's just he's skirting over the reason we play games is to play them. Like the lore can be interesting, yeah. The concepts can be interesting, yeah. But we play games to play them. So tell us about playing them. What the fuck? I also want to come back because he said something kind of funny.
Following that line of thinking, Ludwig must have held on longer than anyone else in the game because, man, is he not just the most horrifying design in the entire game? In the Amelia fight, I talked about how characters at certain points are shown to be able to push back the encroaching beast to it. Gilbert has a cut line from a cut quest where he...
Gilbert has a cut line from a cut quest. Thank you for giving us knowledge of something that doesn't impact something in the game. Thank you. Thank you.
He rejoices that he's been cured.
You know, there's a cut scene in Star Wars where Princess Leia gets down and sucks Luke's dick. Totally not true, but what's it matter if it was cut? What's it matter? Doesn't fucking matter. Yeah, it's like lore can be interesting, but there's a time and a place. You can give me a 7-hour lore video from VodiVidia, and I'm there all day. I think he actually just did one like a week or two ago about Armored Core 6. I'm not really interested in it just because I don't really care about Armored Core that much, but given Vadia's track record of making really good videos, I'd actually wager if you're into Armored Core 6, you'd probably enjoy it, especially because it's super long. There must be a lot of lore in that game.
Amelia clutched the pendant. Gascoigne heard the music, and Ludwig is reawakened once he sees his guiding moonlight. After he's been defeated, Ludwig will talk about seeing threads of light, which is the guidance rune,
That's because I'm there for the lore. If there's analysis on a game, I probably want to hear a lot from the mechanics side of things. Yeah. Again, lore is interesting. Gameplay is too. You got to balance the two.
Description reads, a carol rune discovered by the old hunter Ludwig along with the holy moonlight sword. Boosts amount of life recovered by rallying. When Ludwig closed his eyes, he saw darkness, or perhaps nothingness. And that is where he discovered the tiny beings of light. Ludwig was certain that these playful dancing sprites offered guidance. They could empty Ludwig of his fears, at least in the midst of a hunt.
I need to watch that at some point, but I got to generate that binge watching mode. I mean, for videos that long, I think it's just a matter of just put it on when you can, and if you got to stop and come back to it later. That's one nice thing about YouTube is that it does track relatively well where you stopped off at. So I mean, you know, or if you got 5 or 6 hours just with nothing to do, there you go. Take a really nice, really long hot bath and watch VodiVidia explain Armored Core lore. Armored Core lore. That's kind of fun to say. I may have to look at the Orphan of Cost section when you end stream just to see if Orphan even gets his gameplay recognition. Yeah. If you do, don't spoil it for me. because I want to see I want to see if he skirts over it too. But I'm gonna try to end this section, and then we'll probably end the stream. So made decent progress though. We made about 40 minutes. So let's see how this ends up.
This fight almost made to the point that beasthood could be conquered from within, but unfortunately, because it's set in a nightmare, we don't know if Ludwig actually is a beast which manages to wake up, or if this form is just the punishment which the Wrath of Kos doles out to him. He was a man who slaughtered beasts, so now he shall become a beast which slaughters men. And without the guidance offered by his sword, Ludwig shall be absorbed by the blood drunkenness and evolve into a monster. I think Ludwig's last-minute recovery is one reason he is so beloved in the community, but I'm not going to pretend that the Moonlight Sword isn't a factor.
I won't spoil it for you. And speaking of which, I gotta see the comments. That's the thing. I might go into the comments of the video after I watch the full thing, because I do think it is important to watch the entire video before you leave a comment. Now, with something this big, I kind of understand leaving comments at different points, but I do think it's a good idea to wait to watch the whole thing before we look at the comments, just so we get the maximum amount of like context possible. But we might save that for the end of the stream. So we've got about 2 hours left on this. There might be 2 or 3 more streams, depending on how much shit we see. Oh boy.
Down these stairs, we have our first encounter with Braydor, whom I'll talk about later. But since I've talked a big game about how the Simon encounters were all well constructed, I should note that I'm not a fan of how inconsistent the quest advancing triggers are in the DLC. Simon appears near Ludwig's head if you warp to the Hunter's Dream and back, which I don't think is bad design, since most players would probably do that anyways to cash in their echoes, but he didn't actually appear for me, so after 3 failed warps, I decided to cut my losses and move on. This also happened with Adeline's quest, and I had to cut out 6 minutes of myself just warping in and out of the area, hoping to have the game register that her quest should advance. People celebrated Dark Souls for how NPCs wouldn't always be at Firelink Shrine and that it made them feel like independent agents in the world rather than utilities for the player. But seeing this here, I wonder if the engine is just bad at telling NPCs to load where they're supposed to load, rather than this having been a creative decision. Funnily enough, Simon appeared on the very next load of the area, so
Talk to big game. No, you talked a big lore. You had your chance to talk a big game with Ludwig. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, he said talked a big game about Simon, so let's hope he actually does something with Simon other than just say, some cut content of Simon meant that he was actually supposed to be Garmin at some point. It's like, yeah, I feel like he's just going to pull some stuff out of the production black hole that he keeps bringing stuff out of, which is sad because, again, you're talking about stuff that's not in the game. It's like a ending for a film that was filmed and then cut and replaced. It's like there's no real point to talk about it unless you just want to give context for the real ending that we got. It's just weird.
So I will be talking to him near Ludwig's grave later, but I want to make note now that the encounter happens organically for most players. I've talked about how this nightmare is a linear walk back in time, and it goes missed by some that this battle arena is the interior of the Grand Cathedral. I know it didn't click for me in my first go-through, that what we're seeing here is an earlier version of it from the one we met Lawrence in earlier. I'll be able to ascend this area right after dealing with these 2 NPCs. I could actually skip them, but that's not really in the spirit of things. The implication with the bets is that the Healing Church was once overburdened by the amount of patients it got, and that facilities like the altar of the Grand Cathedral were hastily made into chambers to keep these patients. I want
to go back and replay that combat clip for a minute just because I think it kind of perfectly explains kind of how it looks like he plays the game.
Of patience it got, and that facilities like the altar of the Grand Cathedral were hastily made into chambers.
So you see that there? You see that there? He heals when the enemy is way too close to him, and when he knows the other ranged enemy is within range, and he proceeds to get smacked and stunned and shot and killed. It's like, I understand, like, you're gonna fuck up in these games, like, nobody's perfect, but, like, what the hell, man? That was incredibly bad timing. Like, almost intentionally bad timing. You're not gonna talk about how unfair the NPCs are, even during your death sequence? Maybe he will. Maybe he'll fight these guys for a while. Who knows?
To keep these patients. I could separate the two NPCs by going back down the stairs into the cell area, but that is not really in the spirit of things either.
What? That's not in the spirit of things? What are you talking about? It's two tough NPCs that can smack the crap out of you and kill you. It's a frustrating fight. Why not abuse it? Why not?
Because the black-clad lady is using Ludwig's Holy Blade, I'm going to illustrate how the elemental buffs were erroneously coded into the game. Whenever I've applied fire paper to one of my weapons, I've been giving it a flat 80-point damage increase. Enemy defenses or susceptibilities have then done their jobs of either lowering or increasing that damage. In its transformed mode, the best
If I'm close to that, I do tend to get that heal in just so I can survive, back off, and then get a proper heal. But really, yeah, I mean, I can understand why people would try to heal when they're that close, but I just try to get farther away. I mean, personally, what I would have done in that situation is dodge left after an attack, and if I make it, heal, because then you have the coffin in the way between the spellcaster and you. So you don't have to worry about that, and you can keep your eye on the black churchgoer person. It's just bad playing of game, and it cost him his life. This man was in view of the ranged spammer. You don't want to do that. Yeah.
best thing about my current weapon is that I can lock enemies in recovery frames. This much I've already said. But the slow swing speed means that if I had a faster weapon, the buff would actually compound some more. Because it's a flat 80-point increase regardless of weapon mode, and that damage is not adjusted for each weapon's swing speed. Faster weapons get more buffs. Why does this warrant mentioning? Observe. Each individual hit.
Man, did you see that? Let's go back to his little showing himself doing something.
More buffs. Why does this warrant mentioning? Observe. Each individual hit the white-clad lady takes from the whirligig saw has a damage buff applied to it because of the fire paper, and the damage increase is hardly adjusted for the attack speed.
I was about to say, like, whoop-de-doo, he did 400 damage, which I think is roughly the same as 2 swipes from his sword, which took him longer to do, and he had to buff the weapon. I don't think this is that great of a move. Just saying.
The whirligig saw can perform way more attacks per second than any other weapon I've used thus far, and each one of those little shreds is getting the fire paper buff. This is such a stupid weapon, but it's so good, and if it was upgraded as much as Ludwig's Holy Blade is right now, this would have been way more impressive. The statue on the
That is a good point, though. I didn't consider that it may not be upgraded appropriately. But still, it's like you're wasting a lot of stamina on an attack where the enemy has to get basically right in your face to take the damage when they could probably slap you from far away. I don't think it's a fun weapon, but it's really impractical.
elevator is of Lawrence, who has clearly styled his getup on Willem. Bloodborne uses environmental storytelling more liberally than its Souls predecessors, likely because the ability to render more detailed environments just naturally made the developers do that. like with our talk earlier on widescreen and action games. But even so, its story is more difficult to piece together. One big reason for that is that the game actually expects you to link the fact that things like the Hunter's Rune being found in the Chalice dungeons is significant, rather than just texture reuse. After raising the elevator, underneath it, the altar is revealed, where we can find Lawrence's human skull, which isn't actually his real skull, but seems to rather be the manifestation of his lost humanity, which is kept away from him in the dream.
You know what? That does make sense, since judging by weapon at risk, he doesn't take trips to the hunter's dream. I mean, that's what the thing is. Like, you would think that when you go to the dream, since it takes so long to get there and get back, you would like do everything you need to while you're there. Like, usually what I do anyway, because I kind of went back and have played Bloodborne while going through this video, and like every time I go back to the dream, I usually level up as much as I can, barring maybe one level, and then I use that other level to like buy supplies and repair weapons and shit. So I mean, either he's doing all levels just to get his build sort of reset up again, or maybe it's just he's just playing a weird way. Now, I would be interested in what he says about the research hall, since the deplorable things done to the patients is interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's where the lore, I think, would really come into play in terms of just seeing what happened to these poor folks. Which we're almost there. We're almost there. Let's wrap this section up.
And its location on the altar connects to how his actual beast skull is in the same place in the waking world. I'm going to devote quite a bit of time to Lawrence before this video is over, so trust me that this is important to keep in mind. For now, however, we need to talk to Simon in the underground corpse pile to advance his quest, and then get to the research hall. I've already talked at some length about Miyazaki's recurring theme of flow, but water in and of itself is notable here because it seems to be a barrier between humanity and the Great Ones in some capacity. It seems like it's an important step to ascension, and so...
Okay, I thought he was actually gonna... Okay, I thought he was gonna finish up the Arnhem Nightmare with the Simon thing, but I guess not. Okay, let me go back here. All right, we'll end it right there. I keep track of the time stamp so that I can like save it for later. So 5:30:25. We are getting there. Oh, I'm so ready to like finish this video, but there's still so much to go. You don't understand how heartbroken I still am after he gave Lovewood the most bare bones compliments on his combat mechanics. I know, right? Like, I really feel like he plays these games for lore as opposed to actually playing them to like play them mechanically. Like, it just seems like a really weird... Like, I would actually not be surprised if he got someone else to record this for him, like the actual gameplay, and he just didn't pay attention when editing it, or he handed it off to somebody else. I would actually not be surprised by that. I actually wouldn't, because I mean, just the way he plays the game and what he shows are not consistent with what he like wants to like demonstrate. Like, what he says oftentimes conflicts with what he's talking about, and like when he says something is, the optimal healing thing, it's like he didn't do the optimal healing thing. If anything, he used it in the worst way possible earlier in the video. It's like, why do you do that? Why do you do that? It's really weird. My brother in Yarnum, that is not water. That is clearly blood from the gratuitous amount of corpses piled up. Pretty sure the name of that specific lamp is Underground Corpse Pile or something like that. Yeah. Well, I don't think he's talking about this blood specifically. I think he's talking about kind of the idea of the water being a separator between the Great Ones and humanity. And there are references to that in the game. With Bergenworth being right out of the lake, and in order to reach Rom and open up access to more Great Ones, you essentially have to go through a waterway of sorts. So he's right about that. He is right about that, and he didn't mean this area specifically. But we are going to have to come back to this at another time. We made good progress though. Got about 40 minutes, so we could hopefully end this in maybe 2, maybe 3 more streams, something like that. I really want to move on and watch something else. I'm tired of watching this. I'm not really tired of watching this in terms of like talking about it. It's just doing these short little streams to like get through this is a drag when I've been doing this for like 2 months at this point. Or I think actually no, I think about 3 at this point. It's just, oh my god. It's so much Bloodborne is better because, and then I get angry when some of the because is not right. But anyway, that's going to be the end of this stream. Let me know if there's any if there are any other videos y'all would like me to watch. I am open to watching more Soulsborne thingies. I've actually thought about watching Joseph Anderson's coverage of Dark Souls 3 just because he's said some pretty stupid things about other games I've liked, and I'd like to talk about some of his content a little bit. So it'd be fun to rag on him for a while. Just because. Also, it's fun. But we'll see how that goes. And yeah, I'd just like to thank you all for watching. And I will see you guys later. Hey, Sheep, if you can find the Dark Souls 1 analysis, send it to me. Because after this, I'm not going out of my way to find it. But anyway, thank you all for watching. See you next Saturday.